Okay, take it away.
All righty. Adam, can you make me a host? I'm gonna forget every time too. It's okay. All right, awesome. Hello, everyone. Great to see you guys. Welcome to meeting number 9 of the Energy Code Board. I hope you guys are having a good week so far. And we're excited to dive in today. So today, is going to be our last major chance to have a substantial board discussion around the Energy Code Board, starting at meeting number 10, which will be this coming Monday, March 6th. We'll start our preliminary voting process. We'll continue that preliminary voting on our meeting on March 20th, and then we'll have a public comment meeting and a final vote meeting. So all to say and to emphasize that this is really the best last chance for us to collect your feedback. With that in mind, we have a couple of topics that we are looking to get through today. And so I'll just say that as much as possible, I'm going to be trying to keep us on track, keep us lined up with this agenda so that we make sure we get through everything and make sure we have a chance for the board to weigh in on everything. So what that's going to look like, we'll start with approving the meeting minutes, and we'll ask the board if there are any public comments that they'd like to bring up or share. And then we'll move into our discussion to wrap up the small commercial electric ready code discussion. We'll transition then into the large commercial electric ready code discussion, and expecting that will probably take a good chunk of time. And then there are 3 topics that we are looking to discuss with the board following the large commercial electric ready discussion. Those include the variance process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. A question around major renovations, and then more of an FYI update on natural disaster variances. And then we'll wrap up, remind everybody of their impending deadlines for reviewing code language. Make sure you guys all feel comfortable with the timeline we've got mapped out, and then we'll let you go. Sound good? Any thoughts, questions on agenda? All right, I'm not hearing any. So let's move forward with approving the meeting minutes. Can I have a motion to approve meeting 8 meeting minutes?
Hi, this is Kevin. I move to approve the meeting 8 minutes as presented.
Thank you, Kevin. Do I have a second?
A second.
Thanks, Brad. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, meeting minutes are approved. Thank you all. So now we'll move into the next section of our agenda, which is present an opportunity for the board to share any relevant public comments that they would like to bring up. And Carolyn, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I didn't observe any additional comments submitted since our last meeting. I just wanted to verify it. So I have nothing additional to comment on compared to the prior comments.
Yeah, that's correct. We have not received any new ones since the last meeting.
Andrew, yes.
If feasible, before we got to provide feedback tomorrow, could there be an opportunity to discuss what's due tomorrow and any questions or comments?
We can absolutely cover what is due tomorrow. And if there are any questions about the process, happy to answer those as well. I think we are going to save time in today's discussion to talk about the outstanding items that we haven't yet discussed. And so if there's any discussion that needs to be had around the comments or the proposals for solar and EV ready, I think we're not going to go down into that discussion today.
So then that should be done just via the survey comments?
Correct. Yeah. If you have any thoughts that you want to share with the board and make sure that they see, please include those in the survey. We will pull all of the survey responses, including code proposals and any comments provided by board members, into a one single document, and then we'll send all of those comments out to the board on Friday.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. All right. Any other folks want to speak up for public comment? Okay, hearing none. I think we can dive right into the meat of our discussion today. So we're going to start, excuse me, by wrapping up our discussion on small commercial electric ready code. And as a quick reminder for folks, this is the requirements of the board for per state statute for what we need to develop for the small commercial and multifamily electric ready code. And so this is for small commercial and multifamily buildings under 10,000 square feet. And the statute requires that we consider adequate panel capacity, adequate dedicated electric panel space, adequate electric wire, adequate electric receptacles, and adequate physical space for the future installation of high efficiency electric equipment, including heating, water heating, cooking, drying, and EVs. And so what that looks like is we as a board need to come up with the specifics around the electric circuit, panel sizing, receptacles, all of the electrical infrastructure, and then the location adjacency specifics of those receptacles. And then other things we can discuss and consider for small commercial include condensate drains, labeling, exceptions, water heating specifics, things of that nature, all of the similar topics that we talked about with the residential electric ready code. And some key takeaways, themes that we heard from the last discussion last week is that really, orienting ourselves around the goal of facilitating future replacement while reducing upfront costs. We've heard this theme in a couple meetings now to keep the language broad to enable flexibility, but require some elements to make sure that the adequate infrastructure is addressed. That we will need minimum capacity and physical space for electric equipment and electric service upgrades. And then just want to flag that there was a question from our meeting on Thursday around the water heater electric ready specific provisions that Erie as well as the city of Denver have in place. And so we did follow up with the folks who wrote that code, and we'll share with you guys what we heard back, and we can discuss if we want to include those specifics or not. So continuing on with what we heard at the last meeting, we think pretty firmly some general consensus on these 4 items to include in our small commercial and multifamily electric ready code. Those are a minimum 2-pole circuit breaker space for a minimum 2-pole circuit breaker, but with the contingency that it should be appropriately sized for each electric appliance. So in some cases, that might be a 3-pole circuit breaker, but we will have that minimum language that it needs to be at least 2 poles, but should be sized adequately. The second one is physical outdoor space for condensing units, specifically in the multifamily application, a condensate pipe for the internal condenser, and then adequate capacity and space for future transformers. Carolyn.
Yeah, just in addition on number 2, the physical outdoor space, to make sure we include the word reserved space when defining that.
Okay.
I just wanted to offer that clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. Just writing that down. Awesome. So with that in mind, I guess I'll pause here to say, is there any board member that disagrees with these 4 consensus items that we thought we heard from meeting number 8? Does anybody think that these 4 should not be, one of these 4 or more than one of these 4 should not be carried forward into our requirements? Tim.
Yeah, thank you. So just a clarity on number 2. I know that this covers small commercial and multifamily, and that number 2 just talks about multifamily. And I'm sorry, maybe Carolyn, that was her question. I had this muted, but was that what you brought up too, Carolyn? And so we were going to add that or clarify that?
Yeah, that's correct. It was specifically looking at multifamily where there is not existing, just to ensure that like if it's a non-cooled building, that if there's not otherwise an outdoor unit, that there's space for future outdoor units. And I think it's particularly critical for multifamily where you might need to add mini splits, which would require many outdoor condensing units.
Understood. So I guess the concept would be on small commercial, typically that equipment's set up on the roof so that wouldn't need to be here. The way I would see that.
Correct. It would already be met within the requirement. I think it's a good clarification that the intent is if there is not current space allocated, that there is space for future installation. So that whether that's on the roof, on a balcony, or on the ground, I think is to be determined by the project, but just that there's physical space. And I think the physical space particularly comes into play on the multifamily units.
Correct. And we do have some commercial buildings, small and large, that are all sloped roofs and they don't have the mechanical flat roof section inside the mansards. So that on the sloped roofs, a lot of times we'll see the air handlers and equipment going on the side of the building to support that. So would that be something we need to clarify here or not?
I would offer potentially, just to make sure we're being clear in our language, but I see a couple hands, so.
I was going to just make ask a question / make a suggestion related to that. I'm wondering if, I mean, roof space is also outdoors. And so I'm wondering if that covers saying that there has to be adequate outdoor space, whether or not that's on the ground, whether that's on the side of the building, whether that's on the roof. Just keeping it at that general language would be sufficient, and then apply it to both multifamily and commercial, so that regardless the situation, whether, you know, for commercial, it might be on the roof, for multifamily, it might be next to the building, but that outdoor space requirement would cover all of those.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Don, I'll pass it to you.
So just kind of the HVAC guy in me, just a terminology thing. Internal condensers, not really the correct terminology. It'd be the internal evaporator or internal coil. Either one would be appropriate.
Great. Thank you, Don. I appreciate that clarification. Evaporator or coil. And I want to call attention to Tom's question in the chat. Why do we require installation of condensate pipe for future equipment, but not refrigerant piping? Is the intent to have a receptacle for condensate? That makes more sense to me. Tom, I'm not sure that I can answer that question, but if you're interested, if you'd like to share your question, and then we can see if the board has any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in a situation where maybe you're doing a bunch of wall-mounted units for like a variable refrigerant flow installation. You'd have, you know, 2 refrigerant pipes. You have at least 1 conduit, and you have a condensate pipe. To run that ahead of time before you're even doing that project doesn't make sense to me, as long as we make sure that there's an intended receptacle for the condensate.
Thanks, Tom. So you're saying that there should be a drain called out for where that condensate should go, but the pipe doesn't necessarily need to be installed. Is that what I mean?
Right. Like, I mean, that's part of the engineering effort. I think there should be a plan for a place to discharge the condensate, but to put that 1 pipe in there, but to ignore the refrigerant piping and the conduits and everything else, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Thanks, Tim. John, I'm not sure if you have your hand up to respond to that.
Actually, yeah, I did want to touch base a little bit on that one. I'm going to agree with Tom on, you know, the condensate pipe seems like kind of once again, maybe a terminology thing. If you know, like he said, a drain for condensate would be good. I don't think we should get into trying to get refrigeration piping or anything else put in. That piping is so many times it's manufacturer specific as far as sizing. And I think you would really create more headaches, and it'd be worth trying to get it piped in ahead of time.
Thanks, Tom. Kristen.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in that I agree with that. The one issue we may want to consider, though, is in the eventuality or in the case where someone is doing the interior unit like mini split style or not in the location of where the former gas unit was, they may be ripping open walls, and that may compromise air sealing or air barriers. So that might be a reason to have stuff pre-installed so that you're not compromising your air barrier when you go back to retrofit. But I do recognize that with refrigerant piping, especially with the refrigerant transition that we're seeing over the next few years, that may be impractical.
Thanks, Kristen. So do other board members want to weigh in on that question of should the pipe itself be installed, or should we just have a location mapped for where the future condensate will drain? Or if I'm saying that right, Don, and sorry if I'm mixing up my terms. Tim.
Well, in my experience, I would think that it may make sense on the multifamily side to have something in place like the condensate pipe, but not needed at all in small commercial or big commercial, because if everything I've ever seen, first of all, the code's going to require that condensate pipe to be installed based on manufacturer's requirements, and then it could go out directly to the outside, or it can go to an internal drain, depending. I mean, the code allows you to go either place. So I think yes on the multifamily, but no on the commercial.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Ron, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I don't think it makes sense to actually install the pipe necessarily, but I do think that we often see projects where they want to put it to a drain but can't figure out how to put the drain in, and so I think just identifying where that condensate's going to go is useful up front.
Thanks, Ron. And would you say that rings true for small, large, commercial, and multifamily?
I think it's in the larger projects. It's if you can't find a way to do it, it becomes much harder. But I think that problem shows itself in projects of all sizes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Ron. Elizabeth.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I had this exact thing come up on a project yesterday. So we talked through it. It was an existing multifamily. This one happens to be affordable townhomes that have exactly what we're talking about here. It has a furnace installed and a remote condenser. And the project's going to go through an upgrade and obviously electrification. Upgrading electrification potential was absolutely part of the conversation. In that case, as soon as ownership was getting in and moving things, they wanted to correct some things that weren't necessarily perfect. And that included moving everything. So moving the air handler, moving the condensing unit, rerunning refrigerant piping in a lot of cases. So I think that's a real situation. And it reminded me a lot that we don't want to over-regulate things that, that we're going to require people to spend money on that may not stick around or may not be used.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And so I guess in the terms of centering around this conversation, would you agree with Ron and a couple of others that identifying the drain location, but not necessarily installing the pipe would be your recommended approach?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess, let me ask the question, does anybody want to advocate that pipe itself should be installed?
Well, if you've got an existing condensing unit, there's going to be something installed already.
Okay.
So I think, let me know if I'm misspeaking, but I think this is just in the case where we don't already have cooling provided, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say no.
Okay.
Would be my vote.
Any other thoughts with that? Thank you. Really helpful clarification, Elizabeth, that this would only apply when there is already not a condensing unit on the project, pipe versus just the drain location. All right, I'm not hearing anything. Let me check the chat. Okay, thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. So I'm not hearing anybody state an argument against not requiring the installation of the pipe, but requiring the drain be located. Yeah, Kevin.
So just to be, I agree with if it's in place, no sense putting it there. But can we write it in such a way that if we are putting new cooling in, that it is required? Or are we talking about pathway only, not actually installing a drain?
Kevin, I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you elaborate? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we're saying like where there's existing cooling in place, we're not going to require anything new because it's likely already there to serve this need. But if you're going into an existing condition and you need to install something new, it kind of has to be there. Tim, was your point, or maybe it was Don, that was saying like, well, you're gonna have to do that by code anyway, so that this shouldn't meddle with adding that in. I just want to make sure somebody can't put it in new and then that the drain isn't required, because it will always be required.
Okay. Tim, yeah, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and that was my point. Well, Kevin, I don't think, in my opinion, we don't need to have the additional language, because if it's in place or getting put in place, I should say, in a new build or a TI, however, or I guess this would be a new build, sorry, then the other code, IMC, the mechanical code, is going to kick in and take care of that through that permit process. So, I mean, with respect, that would be, I appreciate your comment, but it might be redundant. And I think
something else has got it already. So let's not muddy up new code with it. Okay. Thanks, Tim.
My opinion. Thank you.
Cool.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And thanks for that question, Kevin. Okay. So I appreciate that clarification. I think I'm not hearing anybody speak out against that. They really want to see the pipe installed. And so I'm going to move us on to this next slide. We will clean up the language here. So note that number 2 here will change based on the discussion we just had. What I wanted to do to try to focus our conversation on wrapping up small commercial and multifamily is show what we heard from you guys that you'd like to see in the small commercial multifamily language, and then what we decided we'd like to see in the residential electric ready language, to see if there's any synergies we can find, and just say, we like what we did for residential, let's pick that and move it into the small commercial and multifamily code as well. So the things in the green boxes are where there's alignment. Again, note number 2 will change for the small commercial. And then those items in the red box are the items that we have left to discuss for small commercial and multifamily. So those include labeling. And for residential, remember we discussed labeling both at the junction box and at the electric panel. The number 4 is adjacency. And so what we came to there was 3 feet adjacency for HVAC appliances and 6 foot for non-HVAC appliances, as long as they're within the same space. Number 5 was reserving physical dedicated space for the air handling unit. And number 6 was a dedicated outdoor circuit for the condensing unit. So are there any thoughts on numbers 3 through 6, if any of those we would like to carry forward into small commercial and multifamily? And Carolyn, I'll start with you.
First, just as a clarification on your residential number 4, you got those reversed.
Oh, oops, I'm sorry. It was a quick turnaround. I appreciate that. Let me just go ahead and make that change so we don't get caught up on that. And thank you for bearing with me as I make this quick change. So that's 6, that's 3. Thank you for that. All right, here we go.
And then I believe it would make sense to carry that number 4 over into the small commercial and multifamily, as well as 5. I'd be interested in people's thoughts on 6, and I support 3 as well.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. So Carolyn is advocating for 3, 4, and 5, and then question to the board on whether number 6 should be carried through.
Yeah, and this is specifically, particularly for the multifamily scenario where you may have many units and envisioning what the future scheme might be in the case where cooling is not currently provided, may present a significant build out. And so that's where I want to hear from my fellow board members on that specific requirement.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Tim, we'll go to you.
Yeah, thank you. So kind of for clarity on small commercial, we probably half the time when we get a shell, core and shell commercial in, sometimes it's residential, a lot of times it's on an industrial flex side. The developer or the owner is only putting in gas-fired unit heaters to provide minimum heat for the water, just the water main, and more importantly, the sprinkler. And so my assumption would be where this thing's going, if you have this junction box wiring, then it would have to just be taken to where that unit heater is. And then when the TI contractors come in, they remove the unit heaters and then show installing RTUs up on the roof and route the gas lines up there. So I'm kind of wondering how that's all going to work with that type of scenario. I know we can't talk about every scenario, but I see this in about half the shell buildings that we get here in Broomfield anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think that's a really important consideration. And I would look to the fellow board folks to see if the board has any thoughts on how to address that. So let's go to Kristen and Kevin, and then anyone who's got thoughts on Tim's question, we'll circle back to that. So Kristen, I'll go to you first.
Now, going back to that question on number 6, the dedicated outdoor circuit for the condenser, looking at the mandate that we consider the cost to retrofit in the future, it seems to me it'd be cost prohibitive if you don't require that up front for a future owner. My 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Kevin, you were up next. Did you want to add any thoughts?
I think what I realized is I misread 6 because I was looking at the space component. I was looking at outdoor space for the condenser, and my caution about that would have been, and maybe it still applies for the physical space for number 5, is how do we define what the space of that is? So from a condenser point of view, like multifamily projects, we have a lot of these where the roof is nearly full of DX condensers, where it's a lot smaller configuration if they go with a VRF configuration. So if you define it as the physical space required, I think we're okay with this. I may be answering my own question, I apologize, but we're saying physical space within the unit for the AHU. Are we saying anything about exterior space other than a circuit by doing this?
And board, please correct me if I'm misinterpreting this. I don't recall in the residential conversation we discussed physical space for the outdoor unit, thinking that if I'm remembering correctly, thinking that wouldn't often be an issue with residential, like 1 to 2 family dwellings. But within the multifamily setting, wanting to make sure that physical space is set aside for those condensing units, because it becomes more of a space challenge in multifamily. But someone please correct me if that was wrong. I think that's what we heard.
Your recollection matches mine.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn.
And again, just as a clarification, I think the physical space concern exists where cooling is not provided at the time for multifamily or small commercial.
Okay, awesome. And Kevin, did you have anything else, or was that you?
No, great. Thank you for summarizing that better than I said it, Carolyn. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Don, we'll go to you.
As far as number 6 in the dedicated outdoor circuit, I get concerned about sizing of that circuit. Unless you plan on doing a heat load calculation in advance, I think you're going to have trouble getting that circuit properly sized. on the outdoor.
Okay, thanks, Don. Did you, and I saw your hand pop on when Tim had asked that shell and tenant improvement question. Did you have any thoughts on that as well, or was it related to number 6? Just 6, okay. Carolyn, we'll go to you next.
I was curious from Tim and our other code officials, because I think the shell conversation is an important one as to the extent with which we can carry through these requirements for the future build out of the building. Because I think the vision is that once that core and shell is built out, that it would be electric ready. And so that wouldn't just be the minimum heating requirement. And so can we impose these requirements or something related to it for core and shell projects within the new construction code?
Tim, I'll move to you, and then I think Ron or any other, if anyone else wants to share or respond to that question from Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you. It's my understanding that this legislation strictly is for new build and not to go beyond into tenant finishes, including a first-time build in a shell. Louisville took that step with their electrification ordinance to also require tenant finishes. I think it's over 5,000 square feet, if I recall, in previously unfinished space. That's not where my understanding, I think Kim and Adam could clarify that. So, but with that question, I'm going to kind of take a step back and talk, I guess, a little bit about 5 and 6 and over into the left box, small commercial and multifamily. So I think what this would be doing is if they have to show both of those, and in particular 6, a dedicated outdoor circuit, to be located in some location, so to speak, then in a shell building, the future tenants, they break it up into potentially multiple tenants or a single tenant or two. I'm not a betting man in public, but I would say that if you've got these placed, I mean, the idea of being electric ready, that's what we're doing, but will it be where they really want to put it for how close, how close they need to be on a side of a building, or if they take it all over and they want to put certain equipment over on one side because that's where their mechanical rooms are, and then or the other side. So that's my point, is making or telling them to put a circuit outside somewhere, and then it may or may not get used. And it's just a comment. And
can I plus one, Tim's? I think one of my proposals, Kim, is I think we need a specific provision for core and shell that addresses the minimum requirements specific to that application to treat them separately from this. And I think it's to Tim's point, which is at least addressing the space for future circuitry, the physical space for future transformer, but not as prescriptive as what we're requiring for ones that are being built out at the time of new construction. So that's going to be my advocacy based on this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Noted. Maybe we'll circle back to that. Rob, I want to go to you first.
Yeah, I wanted to basically pile on in the best possible way of kind of agreeing with that the purpose of small commercial will change over time. I could look to, I mean, there's a Subway restaurant that's not going to be a Subway restaurant the next time it opens up a couple blocks from my house. I mean, end use of these buildings will change over time, and the infrastructural needs will thus similarly change over time.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So within the requirements, well, yeah, Ron, I'll go to you first.
Just had a passing thought, which is that part of the legislation that created this committee also created some money that is going towards advocacy for electrification in a wide variety of ways. And maybe this committee could just make the recommendation that when that group works on those things, that they give specific attention to this issue to really encourage electrification for those, because I do think that fundamentally the structure of what we're doing doesn't lend itself for that sort of business relationship.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, so
Can I ask Ron a question really quick? So
Yeah,
Ron, would you still support calling out core and shell separately?
If we could, I think it makes sense. Because it really, I mean, I don't see a lot of core and shell in my jurisdiction, but fundamentally it does behave really differently in terms of the sequence of construction than everything else we've been talking about.
Okay, thank you.
okay. So I think the one thing that I just want to call attention to is within the small commercial and multifamily, there is not necessarily specific language that says we can change the these components of the electric ready code. There's not necessarily like language that says there's flexibility within that. When we move to large commercial, there is language within the state statute that says cost effectiveness is key, that board has the choice on like what is, how we interpret adequacy. And so as far as the core and shell discussion, I'm just trying to wrap my head around how we can make sure we're state statute compliant while having a separate requirement. And David and Adam, please jump in if you have any thoughts, but Carolyn, and then we'll go to Tim.
Yeah, I would liken back to our conversation in the solar ready codes about what adequate means and what we determine to be adequate. But I also just wanted to acknowledge that I think the core and shell issue does show up less on smaller buildings and more on larger buildings anyway. I think you can just do a catch-all though in calling out separately a specific provision for core and shell that just addresses minimum requirements and meet all of that. That would be consistent with our other conversations, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. I agree with that. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. So, and this could be Adam question. So we could maybe just say, my vote would be you don't do the 4, 5, and 6 on small commercial, but you do on the multifamily. So can we break small commercial requirements and not talk about the shell? Because I understand that then you're doing another subcomponent, and that'd be, because I don't think you need it on the small commercial. Multifamily, similar to residential, makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer to that question would be, and David, please feel free to jump in with thoughts. But my feeling about that is that the statute only requires that small commercial and multifamily have the same elements, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those elements have to be identical for both of those. So all the statute just requires, I'm trying to find where it says the actual requirements for the electric ready. So it just says electric ready requirements for multifamily and small commercial mixed field use buildings under 10,000 square feet. It doesn't say that those electric ready requirements have to be identical for both of those. It just says that we have to have electric ready requirements for each.
Thanks, Adam. David, anything to add there?
I don't have anything I'm having trouble. My computer froze and I'm having trouble looking at the statute, but from memory, that is how I recall it being written too.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in a little bit on the core and shell question. I don't know that we need to have anything separate for core and shell, because, even when a tenant comes in and does the tenant fit out, all of these requirements will have to be met. So it has to be planned for in a core and shell building. And we have tons of core and shell type of submittals a lot of times where folks will just want to get in with like a, core and shell permit and then follow up with the tenant finish permit. Even if they know it's going to be a subway, a lot of times there will be two separate permits that are just phased a little bit. So I don't know that I would necessarily change anything because that future tenant will still have to deal with that issue. And core and shell is surprisingly common for buildings of all sizes, big and little.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that, Elizabeth. And Tim?
Yeah, well, just to clarify again, my understanding of this legislation is it would not require the tenant finish permit to comply with any of these requirements on a shell. So, I mean, I appreciate that comment of, well, they would just have to, but I don't believe that unless you do a further amendment in your local jurisdiction, like Louisville did. But this just general legislation is just dealing with the new build, whether it's a full fit out or even like a partial fit out, half, built out and the other half shell, or just the shell.
Well, the tenant would still have to meet the new construction code. So like, minimum efficiencies of their HVAC equipment and lighting and controls and all of that. So the core and shell part of this design needs to set up everything so that the tenant has the opportunity to comply with code. Like, let's take the rooftop unit as an example. If the building's going to be large enough that it is going to trigger economizer requirements, like that rooftop unit has to be prepared for, even if it's the tenant who is purchasing it. So the core and shell design has to have a physical space for a rooftop unit. It's not necessarily explicitly written that thou shalt make space for the rooftop unit, but we want that space to be accounted for within our core and shell design, even if it becomes part of the tenant finish. I'm not sure I'm saying that very clearly, but I just don't want there to be a loophole, I guess is what I mean.
I understand the point. With that, a tenant finish could come in and do all gas-fired equipment. So on the shell, half the buildings we get, they don't have RTUs up on there. They just are throwing bare minimum unit heaters because it's the upfront cost for the developer. And then tenant finish has to pay for that. In fact, sometimes they'll want to put their RTUs or kitchen exhaust or something like that in the area up on the roof that hasn't even been originally designed as the mechanical area. And then they got to go to the engineer, et cetera. So doing all the electric ready, unless there's a specific local amendment, or in the next couple of years, state legislator, CEO says, now we're going to make the whole state go all electrification, which I don't think I'll see that happening before I retire. But with any case, that's just my opinion on just not needing, in particular, 4, 5, and 6 on the small commercial or even on the big commercial when we start that discussion.
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it. Yeah, I was just gonna say I can see it both ways. It whether it fits into the core and shell side of things or the tenant side of things. Like, if the tenant's putting in the rooftop unit and the tenant's running a gas line, I think the tenant should also then provide this, all the electric ready requirements. So I'd like it to, I guess, stay in place so that the core and shell permit or designers are having to plan for things like the physical space and the labeling and the adjacency. It may not be necessarily included, but I'm hoping we can find a way to still set those tenants up for success so the tenants can meet those requirements. And maybe that's just a wording thing. I don't know.
Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm following all of this. So I think that my big question mark still that I'm not clear on is, Elizabeth, you're saying that when a tenant comes in to finish a space, they have to abide by the building code requirements. So that would include the energy code, and that in theory would include all of these, the electric and solar ready code. And Tim, I'm not sure that that's also what you're saying. It sounds like you're saying that they wouldn't have to abide by the new construction code when they go through that tenant fit out. And so that's the piece I think I need some clarification on, and what applies when a tenant finishes their space.
Well, it'll be a question for Adam and David, but the way that I read this language is it does not apply to tenant fit out permits at all. It's all new build.
Oh, I mean, that's a great point, Tim. We should clarify whether that is, if we're talking about core and shell, I'm thinking this is a new core and shell project. And I think I do agree that the tenant fit out should be then different, whether the project was built under this code or an old code. I think if it was built under an old code, it will go under the section, what is it, section 5, chapter 5 of the IECC, which is alterations. So this language probably does not live in the alterations section. And I think we can make it so that the alterations section does not necessarily, or kind of accounts for that, for the building that was, built in 1986. And the tenant can't make that physical space or that labeling at the junction box or what have you. So I think I'm with you now, and I think we're in agreement. Not sure what the answer there is, though.
To clarify, I would totally agree with that with an older building going through the existing building sections for both the IEBC and the IECC. But this legislation would apply after July 1st to it depends on the clarification if you do update your code to even just a core and shell empty building. Then what we're doing as a board will apply. PV ready, solar ready, EV ready, and then the electric ready. So a developer could get their permit in Broomfield next fall, and they'd have to comply with this, assuming my council adopts this, which they will. Then the building could be totally under construction, and we allow tenant finish permits to come in while the building's under construction. And that tenant finish needs to comply with the current codes that I've adopted, which would be the 21 IECC, but not this energy code at the state.
Yeah, if this is just in new construction, that tenant finish still is an alteration. And if this part of our electric ready is not also included in the alteration section, then I think that tenant would then not have to comply with this, unless we put specific language in the alteration section to address that or encompass that.
So Kristen and Carolyn, before I get to you guys really quick, I want to share that one of the topics we were hoping to get to later in the meeting, and now it seems like a good time to bring it up, is that there is a piece of the language, and I'm just going to X out of this and then go through and scroll down to that slide, where the board has the ability. So I'll provide a little context here. I again was going to save this for later, but I think it's a useful discussion right now. So within the state statute, it reads that any board of county commissioners that adopts or enforce the building codes shall adopt and enforce an energy code that applies to the construction of and major renovations and additions to all commercial and residential buildings. Energy code in this context means both the 2021 as well as the electric and solar ready codes. And so the way that we've interpreted this piece of the statute to say is that right now, as this reads, every individual jurisdiction has the ability to say what parts of the energy code will apply to major renovations and additions. And that, I think, is sort of where, Tim, you were going. Louisville amended theirs to say for tenant finishes, you have to do these additional requirements. And so the board in in the way that we're reading this has the opportunity within this to say, to define what major renovations or additions would trigger a building to have to do the electric and solar ready code. Again, we were going to get to this later, and I think that there are sort of two parts to this question. Part one is, does the board want to define what major renovations and additions are as it relates to this code? Or do we want to leave that up to local jurisdictions? And then if the answer is yes, we do want to define it, how do we want to define it would be part two of that question. So I'm just bringing that up to acknowledge that there is a pathway within the statute to for the board to address this if the board would like to put that specific requirement in place or define what we mean by major renovation in addition. Otherwise, that can be left up to every individual jurisdiction. So with that, that's sort of what I wanted to share on that point. And Carolyn, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the legislative intent was that the first construction of the building to include its tenant build out is intended to meet the spirit of the legislation. And so again, I think that's where in the new construction section, we need the provision around core and shell. And then I think to Elizabeth's point, we need the appropriate provisions in the alteration section to address the first tenant build out of that core and shell.
And Carolyn, just to make sure I'm understanding, so when you're saying the provisions around core and shell, is that exempting electric ready for those just like space?
I think it's ensuring that at the time of core and shell, the things that need to be met within the core and shell that support our electric ready are there. And then also then the tenant finishes that are not addressed at the time of construction of the core and shell address the other components of that. So for example, I would argue the core and shell has to make space for the future transformers, for the electrical panel capacity, service capacity. I think the tenant finishes have to accept responsibility for anything associated with the appliances and routing of conduit, et cetera. So I think we need to parse it appropriately for those core and shell construction projects.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Carolyn. Tim, I'll go to you and I'll flip back to the slide we were working on.
Well, in the chat, I gave everybody my opinion. Need to leave it to the locals like Louisville did. And going down the path that you're suggesting is going to be a huge cost. And I can't tell you what that means, but it will be a significant cost to the tenant finish builders who are coming into the shell. Because if they're not providing, I mean, even if they did provide some of the basic minimal electric ready, that means that they're going to have to go all electrification at that point. And that's the part I don't understand, because I know in Louisville, they went electrification and the tenant finishes coming in over 5,000 square feet, I think it was, will have to go electrification. So are you proposing that the tenant that comes into a previously unfinished space just do electric ready? Or I'm not exactly.
Yeah, I'm proposing electric ready for a previously unfinished space only.
Well, my opinion, if the board's talking about going down that path, I think you got to get some cost studies on that, because I'm sure part of this is what that economic impact could be on the future tenants who probably don't know that when they sign a lease, because a lot of times we've seen, and I deal with this occasionally, with the tenants more on the water usage license fees that the tenant has to pay the additional costs, and they have no idea until they come in for permit and go through our plan review. So I'm just talking about from my experiences that this would just be another layer of that. And I said, leave it to the locals so that the local jurisdiction can do their own discussion with their city council and the impact on the economic vitality and business.
Thanks,
Tim, are
Tim.
you arguing that they shouldn't be electric ready then? I'm trying to follow along with this, and it seems like the legislation's pretty clear on electric readiness, but now we're running into a split incentive issue where we have these core and shell builders that don't want to have to pay for the electric ready components. And then we have tenants that don't want to have to pay for electric ready components. But the law says the buildings, if they're new, have to be electric ready. So like, how do we make sure that we're meeting that
Understood.
without having some provisions?
Well, I'm just going by my experiences with a core and shell building developer. And I think they are going to build it with the minimal costs that they need to allow the maximum flexibility for future tenants, whatever that type of tenant comes in. So you could certainly do the basics for electric ready on a shell, but I'm not quite, I don't agree that the language that we just read now says that this statute would require the TIs in 6 months or a year or 2 years. Sometimes these vacant spaces take that long to get leased out. That's just my opinion. And I would definitely be voting against that. Maybe Adam or David has an opinion, but I think it should be left up to the locals.
Okay, thanks, Tim. We'll go Carolyn, and then Adam, did you want to respond to that
I was going
directly?
to respond to Tim, but I'll let Carolyn go first.
I was also going to respond to Tim. I think if I were to do a cost analysis, the bulk of the cost would be on bullet number 1. More so than creating a circuit within the tenant build out. So I'm less concerned about the cost of that, provided we put the correct things and requirements into the core and shell itself. So I just wanted to offer that up and why I'm advocating for that.
Thank you, Carolyn. Adam.
I guess I was just gonna try to weigh in on how we feel that the statute itself directs this requirement. So Tim, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is you don't believe that it should impact. I guess I'm not involved enough in the work that you do to understand whether or not a tenant finish would be constituted as a renovation or whether that's constituted as completion of original construction. Like I'm not sure which of those two categories it falls under, but our interpretation of the statute, and David, please feel free to jump in here, is that the statute does say that the energy code has to apply to construction of major renovations and additions to buildings, commercial and residential buildings. It doesn't say that the Energy Code Board has to say which renovations and additions it applies to, but it does say that local jurisdictions have to apply it to major renovations and additions. So I think the question here is not so much as whether it should apply. The statute says that it does. The question is whether or not the board wants to provide guidance to local governments on what constitutes that threshold of major renovation and addition to local governments. And I think to clarify too, is that I think what we're talking about here is that this would not be a mandatory requirement, that the local government would still have authority to step in and say, that's not how we want it to apply here, because the impetus here in the statute is on the local government's adoption. It's not on the Energy Code Board's requirements. So I think the purpose of bringing this conversation up was to say, does the board want to weigh in on helping jurisdictions who may not have thought about this consideration understand what that baseline for major renovation and addition might be, but that the ultimate decision about how to proceed would still lie with them. If that's helpful, hopefully that helps provide some clarification.
If I may, there's like two sections to the statute, or two things the statute, at least two things the statute's up to, right? One of them is telling you all how you need to, the requirements or the minimum requirements of the codes that you're drafting, right? That's basically what we've been talking about the last couple months. There's another part of the statute that tells local governments what they need to do and how they need to implement this and when they need to adopt it and what they need to do. And I think that's what we're talking about right now. And those things are not requirements for you all. They don't go to your authority, and they don't go to anything you're required to do, your obligations. So hopefully that just acknowledging that distinction out loud is a little helpful.
Thanks, David. Okay. So I think I've to sort of circle up on the core and shell discussion. It sounds like there's a bit of an outstanding question on whether or not that tenant finish should need to follow the electric ready requirements. I did hear for that Carolyn advocate for the core and shell piece, that electric ready at least be covered from a panel capacity electric service standpoint to be able to accommodate future electrification or future electric ready when the tenant finish happens. So I guess zeroing in on that piece, since that seems like the piece that we know we have jurisdiction over within this board and these requirements, does anybody have any thoughts on Carolyn's suggestion? We'll go to Adam first.
Not necessarily a specific comment related to Carolyn's suggestion, although I generally will say I agree with Carolyn's suggestion. But I just also wanted to kind of re-raise what Kristen mentioned earlier, which is the fact that if core and shell is a very common approach for commercial buildings, which from what I'm hearing from a lot of you, it sounds like it is, we are at risk of, if we do not put the requirement on either the original constructor of core and shell or on the tenant when they're finishing the structure, that you're going to end up with a situation with a large number of commercial buildings being built not electric ready. And the statute does not allow for that. So we have to find a way that the impetus has to be on somebody to do that.
Thanks, Adam. Kevin?
Yeah, I agree with how Adam just summarized that. I mean, we have a lot of situations where you might be designing a multifamily building that has residential required or a retail required at the base as part of a zoning overlay or something like that. To let that space be whatever it wants to be later on is contrary to the intent of the bill, I think. And then similarly, if you take it the other way, we're designing to all retail buildings. So I see it as our responsibility as a designer of those buildings to make sure it has the capacity down the line to meet the intent of this and not give a loophole to say, oh, that's somebody else's problem down the line. And I don't know if there's a code, this is a building official question, maybe if there's a code definition of first generation space in a new build like that can require it. But even down the line, I mean, if your first Office Max goes in and that one conks out and then it becomes something else, I think you still want to have those same requirements apply to the future use of it, or the tenants dictate what happens to the building down the line.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We'll go to Ron.
So as I said before, my jurisdiction doesn't see a lot of core and shell, but when I think about what core and shell is doing is it's really breaking up the new construction process into two very separate permits. And that's done for business purposes, for the development of projects. And it seems to me that we don't want to just leave this electric ready provisions to either party. I think we want to just sort of put the responsibility on both parties, so that we maintain that electric ready provisions regardless of who's using it and how it's using it. Right, that first permit for the core, for that first core and shell permit, it doesn't really give them full occupancy to use that for any particular purpose. So it's only part of there. So I think we do maybe have a responsibility to extend these obligations right on through that the second permit that's needed in order to actually use these buildings.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, Tim.
So we do have a lot of shell permits. I've got 15 of them under construction right now. That seems to be, and we get those a lot over the past several years. So I'm not complaining about that many, because nice to see there's some money out there to be able to build these things in the business sentiment. But with that being said, so the technical process, at least with Broomfield, is when we issue a permit for a shell building, we close the permit out and we give them a certificate of completion, which closes the permit. It does not allow it to be occupied because it's not a certificate of occupancy, because it doesn't have bathrooms, doesn't have heat, or, you know, the required heat, electrical, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the first, as you called it, a first generation TI comes in, we don't use that language. Maybe some other jurisdictions do, but that's a tenant finish that's going into the shell, and it's a first time build. Then we just apply the current codes that are adopted. So if I got a shell building under the 2018 code that's under construction today, and April 17th, when I have my 21 codes in place, then the tenant finish will have to meet the 21 codes, including the energy code. And then if 3 years from now, the space, we go to the 24 codes and the space is still empty, then that'll have to comply with the 24 codes at that point, assuming I have that adopted. Or in this case, what I'm hearing the board say, well, even 3 years from now, if that space has been empty for 6 years, then I think I've heard board members say, then that space would then be required to comply with this energy code that's being produced here with our group. And then you go into the second part of major alterations. And a lot of times we'll do full floor plates in an office building, total gut and rebuild. And that's a major alteration in the eyes of the IECC, even though it doesn't have that 50% threshold like the IEBC. So then does that then kick in the energy code? I'm struggling with that whole concept of how this is going to happen. And I know the concept of being, but I don't believe that that's what this code, the energy code language, I think it's up to the local building department.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Tim. We'll go Caroline and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. So I went back to look in Boulder's energy code into how we treat this, and we have some language that speaks to what Tim's talking about as far as the temporary certificate of occupancy versus the permanent certificate of occupancy and what is required prior of the code official prior to issuing that permanent certificate of occupancy. And I believe that we can take that provision and build in the specific requirements that we want implemented within the tenant finish drawings that would show compliance with the electric ready requirements. And so we would just reference within that provision for core and shell the specific sections of the code that address the requirements. So the CB, whatever numbers that are going to end up in our code language that would need to be addressed. To the broader point of future renovations, I think that's a different topic of conversation. And so I want to stay in the space of the new construction with the first tenant build out. And I think that type of strategy would help get us to address the issue we've been discussing.
Thank you, Caroline. I really appreciate that. And if you'd be willing to share that with our team, that would be great. Elizabeth, I'll go to you.
Yeah, just thinking about Tim's example of the office building that has maybe been vacant. So the way that that when a tenant finish then goes into that vacant office building under any code, so let's say it's 2021 IECC, there are certain things that need to happen and certain things that don't. Things that are hard to change, like your envelope, are not required to be updated or changed by the alteration section of the IECC. You're required to do things within reason. So like, for example, if your alteration exposes the stud cavity, you have to fill the existing stud cavity with insulation, but that's it. If you don't expose the stud cavity, you don't have to do anything. But you do not have to bring the envelope up to the current code when it's existing building. So I think we could take that logic and apply it to these requirements because this is supposed to be an electric ready code, not a renovation code. So the things that can be done within the scope of the alteration should absolutely be addressed. But the things that require major modifications to an existing building, I think should not. that absolutely varies by the scope of the alteration, and that's why that section is written the way that it is. And if you think about it like envelope and how much is that alteration addressing, I think that this could be accommodated without getting too crazy and having giant cost impacts like Tim mentions, because that's definitely important. That we have to remember this is electric ready, not rip it out and change it kind of legislation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I think just to build on that point, echoing what Adam shared earlier, that is already written in state statute that these requirements will trigger like within the major renovations and additions as communities have adopted code, which is typically following that process you just shared, Elizabeth, was if you touch it, you bring it up to code. And so within the tenant fit outs, do we need to include specific language? If they're including electrical and HVAC within their tenant fit out, would it not automatically trigger the electric ready code?
I think some of it, some things that tenant fit out is not going to have control over, like adequate capacity and space for future transformers. It's an existing building.
Right.
So there are
those,
things that they
okay.
can change and things that they can't.
Okay. Adam.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I would maybe ask Ron to speak up. That sounded somewhat like what Ron was proposing, is where there are certain parts of the core and shell construction that the original builder has to comply with, such as the transformer space, and then there are other things that would put the impetus on the tenant to finish. So like all of the requirements would still ultimately be met. It would just be a matter of who is the one meeting which requirements.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And Carolyn?
Yeah, and just for everybody's benefit, if you did not see it, I pasted it in the chat, and the language would be something to affect the core and shell buildings. Commercial core and shell buildings may take credit for the electric ready requirements with the reference sections. That is part of the future interior tenant finish design. And then it would go on. And so I've offered some proposed language that I think addresses kind of the differences that Elizabeth pointed to in terms of the individual projects. So they can take credit for the entirety of the build out and complying with the code to the degree that it's all demonstrated and through drawings and carried forward. And I think that would address the conversation.
Thanks, Carolyn. Tim?
I've got a question in terms of how that works in Boulder. When a developer who builds these types of buildings they typically have a concept of what they're hoping to lease it out to, but 9 times out of 10, that's not what they get, especially the way the economy's been on the retail side or food service, et cetera. So trying to design a base building for even on the energy side for future uses, I have no idea. And I'm not an engineer or designer, so I don't know how you would do that. Trying to do it at minimal cost for the developer who's putting the money up in the beginning. So I'm a little confused about how that works in Boulder.
Kevin?
Just quickly to respond to Tim's question about that. Yes, you do. So, designing a hotel in Boulder right now that has 4 retail spaces, and it's just speculative loads for those. And beyond the speculative loads, it's also just like there is a code maximum lighting power density, watts per square foot of power allocated. And I don't know, maybe Carolyn can speak to like how that is put in place, because if that's working for something for Boulder, then it might be something to consider. Interestingly, the inquiry I got just, a day ago was, hey, that's not enough power for our space. We want to do X, Y, and Z. What can we do about that? So it's a real discussion early on, and it does affect leasing. So from a financial viability of the projects, I want to make sure we don't like drill things down so tight that the requirements we put on these things limit, future retail space or usability of the spaces going forward.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I think we have some good suggestions on how to consider the core and shell aspects of these requirements. And I think I'll need to just review the notes and the recording and digest all of the things that you guys have shared, and we'll present something back in the code language. I do want to direct us a little bit of our energy back to some of these more specific requirements and away from the core and shell discussion, so that we can make sure we're getting through these items for small commercial, and definitely to save time to make sure we have the ability to discuss large commercial. So centering back on the slide that we've got up, I think I heard from some folks that number 3 from the residential side should be considered for small commercial and multifamily. Number 4, 5, and 6 are important, but perhaps just in the multifamily setting or context. And I'm wondering if others have any agreement or disagreement on those points. Carolyn, I'll go to you.
I would still advocate for 4.
In the small commercial and in multifamily context.
Yep.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the board on these elements? Rob?
I'd like to, for number 3, I think labeling at the electric panel as opposed to the junction box, because again, I think that the purpose of these buildings is going to change over time, and what ultimately fuels a water heater might fuel a induction cooktop at some point in the future. So maybe at the junction box is less important.
Robin, I guess I would follow up with a question on that. If someone was coming in to change the space, would it still be helpful to understand what that junction box was intended for, so that you have a better understanding of the power capacity and what the intent of that was?
Maybe you label it with a voltage and amperage, but I'm not entirely sure it's as useful as probably we expect it to be in the res space.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Tim, and then Elizabeth.
So once again, in reference to number 4, if I have a shell building and it's got 4 unit heaters that are gas fired, then this would say I'd have to, not me, they would have to put in the electrical junction box and wiring to within 3 feet or 6 feet, either way, to that gas unit heater. And that would meet what this and the board would want to see. Is that correct?
Tim,
that's not what I was advocating for.
Yeah.
I think we're requiring that to be shown for permanent certificate of occupancy. We're requiring that to be shown in the tenant finish design.
And then for the core and shell, Tim, I think what I've heard the board advocate for is that there be a requirement that sufficient electric panel capacity is provided in the building for the build out of electric ready tenant finishes. But that for those just like unit space heaters that are put in the core and shell building, that we would not necessarily require those to be electric ready, understanding that those will just be taken out for tenant finish. Does that help clarify that, Tim?
I'd like to see that code language before I could comment.
Okay,
that's fair. I've been going round and round, and I just, I'm looking at the real world with these types of projects that I see all the time. I'm just trying to put 2 and 2 together with this language, if number 4 went in, or if we end up with some, which I didn't think we could do a separate line item or classification for a shell building. I thought I'd heard we didn't have that ability. If we don't, then I still recommend that then we don't need to have the minimum number 4 as part of the shell. I mean, multifamily,
yeah.
I think we're not arguing on multifamily.
And I think, and others correct me if I'm wrong, I think the board agrees with you, Tim, that number 4 should not apply to core and shell. Elizabeth, I'll go to you.
I was just going to say, I am starting to get confused when people say number 4. Which number 4 are we talking about here? I don't know if anyone else besides me is confused, but now I'm completely lost.
That's, yeah.
If we're talking about small commercial and multifamily versus residential, and what number fours and which type of projects.
Sorry, I would clarify.
Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I got a little lost there.
The number 4 in the red box. So I
And
think it's
that
been-
would apply, so since that's, is the question then, do the red box items also apply to commercial and multifamily?
That's what we've been discussing, if
Yes.
I'm correct.
Yes. Apologies for the confusion there, Elizabeth.
Okay.
And I was also referring to number 4 in the red box when I was speaking to number 4 for not being relevant for corn shell. The red number 4, not the green number 4.
Hope no one on the line is colorblind.
I agree. Did you have a thought on
I
on
was
those.
also going to just advocate for labeling of everything. It doesn't cost anything and it can only help and not hurt.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Ron, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I was gonna referring to number 4 in the red box. Not that it's not part of the core and shell permits, but that rather it's not part of any permit that only gets a certificate of completion. But I would tie it specifically to permits that end up with a certificate of occupancy.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Any other thoughts? So I guess I'm hearing general support for labeling, with Rob acknowledging your concern that perhaps the junction box labeling might not be appropriate. And I'm on the residential side, so labeling over here, number 3. Number 4, for adjacency, that this should apply in small commercial and multifamily where there's a certificate of occupancy. I believe, Ron, that's what I just heard you say. And then for number 5 and number 6, maybe these just apply for multifamily context. Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's only going to throw out one other thing I meant to comment on, like Tim's example of the core and shell that has gas unit heaters. I would say yes, that those should be made electric ready. And honestly, what's probably going to happen is then people won't put in gas unit heaters. And then, we have created an effective code, because then they're probably just going to do electric unit heaters, right? I think that's fine. So I would probably still require it, even if it's considered temporary.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Do others want to weigh in on that point from Elizabeth, since I think that differs from the conversation we've had so far? Does anybody else want to weigh in or agree or disagree with Elizabeth's point that that electric ready conduit should be run for those unit heaters? Carolyn?
I was going to argue that I think number 4 should apply to the tenant finish design, which should incorporate the future state of any unit heaters, shouldn't it, as well as any additional build out.
Including the unit heaters that are part of the core and shell, because a lot of times they'll just throw some stuff in there for freeze protection. It's usually electric, but in the case that it is gas, I think that those should be should have the power provided here, as we've outlined in the red number 4.
That's fine.
Brad?
Yeah, so in terms of, and I'd like to get, Tim Pate would be a good source for this, but in terms of these core and shell space heaters, often during tenant finish, these things are gone, completely go away. And I see it as, therefore, when we're putting in that junction box or that 6 feet, 3 feet from those appliances, that's going to just be an asset that just is no longer used once that, like, let's say those Resnor heaters or whatever goes into that space. Like, that's going to change entirely during the tenant finish. So I would sort of advocate for what Carolyn has said, that maybe number 4 gets passed on to the TI in some way.
Thanks, Brad. And I think Tom and Kevin are agreeing with you in the chat on that. Okay. So
I'll just throw in there, I don't think the IACC has a definition for temporary equipment. So there could be a game that's played there. I'd still advocate for, even if it's temporary, to keep this, what we would consider temporary, to keep this as being applied in the hopes that then it would discourage people from installing temporary gas-fired equipment.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. I do just want to emphasize within Brad's point, to the charge of the board to consider upfront costs requirements. And so if in a case where a unit heater that's gas fired is installed in a receptacle conduit, wire is put in place within 3 or 6 feet of that unit, and then it's never used, that to me starts to get into the gray zone of like, is that wasted time, material, money in the upfront cost that maybe didn't need to be there, for considering the cost effectiveness of the upfront construction. Aaron and then Tim.
Yeah, sorry, and I just joined, so I may be way behind this conversation, but isn't red number 4 applying to residential? Why are we talking about tenant finish and empty shells?
Yeah, so Aaron, lots of context to catch you up on.
Don't worry about it then. I'll watch the video. I'll watch the recording.
Okay, just for quick, so you know where we're at. This slide, what we're looking at is the green box under small commercial multifamily. These are things we heard last meeting, and then under residential, these are the things we heard from you guys that you guys wanted for residential. So we're looking at the items in the red box to say, should any of these just automatically apply to small commercial and multifamily, so we don't have to rehash some of those items. Tim, we'll go to you.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment, Brad. And also Kim with pointing out the language, that the vast majority of the projects that I see, probably well over 90%, those unit heaters are just being installed for the bare minimum to keep heat, for the sprinkler system and the water line main. And they typically get taken out, and then the gas lines can be reused to feed, regular air handling equipment, usually up on the roof. And so they're just there. I mean, a temporary, it's just a different, you could play that game. They're temporary, but they're sometimes there for many years. And so occasionally I've seen those stay in place and get added on to get more of them, like in an open warehouse area where that leasee was able to use those. But it's pretty rare on that. So I think to keep that in mind from a cost standpoint for the board.
Yeah, thanks for that added perspective, Tim. Okay, so I think I am hearing, and Elizabeth, not to discount your point, I think I'm hearing more so from the board that those temporary unit heaters, not making those electric ready seems to be more of where I'm hearing consensus on this board. And so, yeah, Elizabeth, I'll let you speak to that.
Sorry, my earbuds are giving me fits. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, sorry. Again, we can't define temporary. It's not a defined piece of equipment. So, you could have somebody put in a rooftop unit for a future tenant and call it temporary. And maybe it will get changed out later. Maybe it won't. Maybe these are electric unit heaters, but I don't think the building code can decide the timing of that. How long is it going to be installed before it doesn't count as temporary anymore? That's just a tough one from an enforcement standpoint. And I think misses the, what we've been tasked with for electric ready. Electric ready isn't always going to be the cheapest option. Part of the purpose of doing electric ready is to make you reconsider whether you want to do gas or not. I would hope that if someone's actually installing temporary equipment, that they would see this requirement and then not make that temporary equipment be gas. So that's my thought on that.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. And I appreciate you reminding us that we don't necessarily have a definition for what a temporary piece of equipment would be. And so how we would distinguish that would be a challenge. Ron, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I just to come back to this, and maybe I'm not thinking about this right, but it seems to me if we're focused on projects and the certificate of occupancy as the trigger, then we don't really care if it's temporary or not. It's not going to be an occupied structure until we have something that triggers a certificate of occupancy. So the core and shell distinction doesn't matter. It's just not a done project. There's no certificate of occupancy issued. And so we can put all these requirements on whatever we need to be in order to get, that final certificate of occupancy. So they can still install whatever they want to install on a temporary basis until that building ultimately becomes occupied. And then these requirements would all kick in at that point.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tim.
That's
Elizabeth,
really
you wanna
hard to
respond?
modify. That's really hard to modify. You put that gas rooftop unit in and then you make the tenant go and add these requirements. That doesn't seem quite fair on the tenant.
It's still just a shell though. So they typically are, again, I would defer to Tim on how often this happens, but it seems to me that that the tenant is going to have to do quite a bit of work to finish out that space. And they have at that point full access to all the building cavities and everything else to run what they need to run then.
I say sometimes yes and sometimes no. It could vary a lot. Like a retail pad, they may very well go ahead and put that rooftop unit in and, to try to encourage a tenant to come in. My core and shell office spaces will almost always install the rooftop units. And then maybe the tenants are just installing, say, a VAV reheat box. So there will absolutely be things that are installed that are permanent as a part of a core and shell permit.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Ron. And if I'm understanding, Ron, your point, are you expressing that even if that, let's say, a gas-fired unit that's being defined as temporary, when a tenant comes in to finish that space, they'd be beholden to electric ready requirements. So if they keep that, they then have to make it electric ready.
Correct.
So that trigger would come at the tenant finish, and it would not come necessarily until that certificate.
Right, but and the thinking being that if the owner of the building knows this and it's very clear up front, then that's gonna incentivize them. If they're putting in rooftop units that are likely to remain permanent, they're gonna want to do that work then, because otherwise the tenants are gonna have to pick up that cost, and that's gonna make it a less desirable building.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that, Ron. Tim, see your hand up.
So this discussion keeps going round and round, and especially on the shell side that we brought out and these future tenant finishes. I would appreciate seeing a very specific legal opinion to clarify that not the intent, but the language in this legislation would apply to future tenant finishes in previously unfinished spaces at any time in the future. And if that's the legal opinion I see, rather than just board opinions, and I respect everybody's opinions, then so be it. That's how we will enforce it when I adopt it in Broomfield, and I would assume everybody else. So I would just like to see that legal opinion. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's a very fair ask, Tim. And so Adam, and then I saw David, you unmuted, so I'll let you guys take it.
Go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to say, like, David, let's take this and let's talk about it. My view, Tim, I think the major question is whether or not a tenant finish is constituted as completion of original construction, in which case, if that's the case, then that's covered under the code. The code covers all new construction. If it's not covered under new construction, if that is not constituted as a component of new construction, and it's constituted as a future renovation of an existing building, the statute also says that the code must apply to major renovations of existing buildings. So I'm a little confused. It seems to me that regardless of which side of that it falls under, it seems to me that the statute is pretty clear that a local government must adopt a code that applies to both of those. So it seems to me that the argument of which of those it falls under is a little bit moot. And I would ask David maybe to weigh in further. And maybe David, we just need to talk about this offline too, but because
Sure,
I think we keep
that's
going round and round here and it's hard and we're going to get stuck and we need to move on.
Adam, I share your initial reaction. Let's go offline and just look at the, the specific statutory text so that we're not doing it here in real time.
Okay, appreciate that, David and Adam. And Carolyn, I'll go to you.
Yeah, and while we were talking, I did some polling on our side, and if it's helpful for you, Adam and David, our chief building official and legal team considers the new construction requirements to apply to the first tenant finish. And so that would be their opinion as well. And then, as you said, Adam, any other renovations would be alterations under our code. So I think we would be consistent with our discussion, and it's just simply a matter of clarifying what has to happen for a core and shell permit in terms of any requirements associated with that. But that was their opinion from my polling.
Thanks, Carolyn. So I'm going to make a recommendation that we table this until Adam and David have a chance to circle up offline. Really appreciate everyone who has shared their sort of thoughts on this. And Carolyn, thanks for doing some extra polling. And then we will report back to the board after we've been able to have that discussion. And so I think moving through the rest of today's meeting, if we can keep aside the core and shell discussion and not try to bring those elements into our discussion for the remainder of the building stock or just fully built out new construction projects, I think that'll help us keep focused. And then we can dive back into the core and shell piece when we have a bit more legal direction. Does that sound like a fair path forward? Okay. All right. So I'm going to move us along from this slide. I feel like I've gotten some good guidance from you guys on where to head. I did want to make sure within the small commercial residential discussion that I brought up, that I shared the insights that we got from the code developers for Erie on why they included these three provisions within Erie's code specific, and these are specific requirements for electric readiness for water heating equipment. So this first one, minimum dimensions of 3 feet by 3 feet by 7 feet high. The intent here, as we I'm sure can assume or gather, is that it's for reserving physical space for the future water heating unit. And heat pump water heaters are a bit taller than gas tank water heaters, which is why they specified that height piece, the 7 feet high. With a number 2, the intent behind this was to give the heat pump water heater adequate source of input air, ideally somewhat warm air, and a place to send the cool exhaust air. And so there's a lot of different configurations that can be thought through, but the overall intent is that the home has a heat pump water, electric ready is obviously the intent is that you electrify first, but that if not, you want the electrical and physical conditions to be able to swap that out. So I think the key pieces here are the key point behind number 2 is really considering that exhaust air because an input air because that unit will be inside the thermal envelope. In most cases, and not all cases, though we recognize. And then number 3 is self-explanatory. That's the condensate drain, and that's specific. They include that specific for multifamily as well as residential. So with that explanation in mind, I'm not sure. I'll move us back to this. This was the one outstanding piece that we didn't necessarily get to wrap up our discussion on last week when it came to small commercial and multifamily. From what we've seen in other communities' code language. And so I think general direction we heard from the board is keep things limited in their prescriptiveness and keep them broad for flexibility. So I would ask the board if their interest in including some specifics around water heating, electric readiness, similar to what Erie had. And I'll also flag that Denver has similar language within their code. Ron, go to you.
And this is just a Boulder County probably specific example, but we end up having a lot of folks who are constrained by the maximum amount of residential floor area, And they typically will use a crawl space that is a maximum height of 6 foot 8 inches to avoid it counting as residential floor area. And they often use that space for their mechanical equipment. So a 7 foot high requirement would conflict with that and sort of create a pretty challenging design thing for many of our homeowners. I don't know. I think that maybe that just points to the fact that being a little bit more general is a little bit better than being more specific.
Yeah, okay. I appreciate that, Ron. Any other thoughts on the Erie? And I guess I can move it back to this slide. Erie requirements, Kevin?
Yeah, great example, Ron. Thank you. And I think that leads back to the keeping it more general of saying provide space for rather than being so prescriptive of the dimensions of it. And I know that leaves like, oh, I left some space. See, there's that 12 foot or 12-inch square space for it. But if we try to define that, it goes really deep and could have some unintended consequences.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that, Kevin. Chris?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I would trust Kevin and Ron's expertise, but do want to flag that, I think achieving the goals means it's really important that, we leave spaces that are appropriately sized for future heat pump systems. And, as long as the technical experts feel like this will achieve that, then I think that sounds appropriate. But I guess I would kick that back as a question.
Thanks, Chris. Kim?
I'll just chime in that I have done HERS rating testing on several multifamily units, and the only ones that have hot water heat pumps are located in crawl spaces that are quite high. Because they're on a steep slope, they were able to do that with a crawl space. But I personally, so far, have not seen any hot water heat pumps that are not at least 7 feet high. I did notice how much taller they are than typical hot water tanks. So I think, again, just kind of echoing what Chris said, that it is important to make sure that the space is adequate. However, that gets incorporated into being space in the building.
Thanks, Kim. And, I think just to what I've heard that, we will include the language around providing sufficient dedicated physical space for that future swap out. I think the question is, do we want to get prescriptive with how high, what the dimensions are, and recognizing that this is a minimum code and jurisdictions like Erie or Denver can follow this example and get more prescriptive if that's a desire. Do any other folks want to weigh in on that? Yeah, Carolyn?
Yeah, I would just put the onus to appropriately identify the space and then allow jurisdictions. I mean, I think I'd put strong language that it needs to be appropriate. And I don't want to be the one to advocate for lower efficiency technology, but there's other solutions if we are in a space constraint that still allows for electrification in a reasonable way. So I would err on the side of a little bit more flexibility here and not be so prescriptive.
Thanks, Carolyn. Brad?
Yeah, thanks. I think we can also really rely on manufacturers' installation instructions on these heat pump water heater appliances. Most of what I've seen, they have really specific guidance on where and how these pieces of equipment can be installed. You can put them in a pretty small room, just as long as you duct it per their instructions. So I don't know if we need to be certainly as specific as number 2. Most of everything I've seen from the A.O. Smith and the Rheem that I've looked at certainly kind of designate that 7 foot high. But again, we can sort of just lean on manufacturers' specific installation instruction.
Okay, thanks, Brad. So I'm generally hearing that these 3 pieces, perhaps, we already have condensate drain, but that number 1 and number 2 on this slide are perhaps a little bit more prescriptive than the board is willing to go. And so keeping the requirement less prescriptive, more flexible, but making sure it is very specific in its direction that there must be adequate physical space for the future water heater. Can I get some general nods or thumbs up, or if anyone wants to disagree with me, please do so. Elizabeth, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I was just doing a quick Googling of like the A.O. Smith requirements, and these things change a bunch. So it's been a little difficult to keep track of. But the 3 feet by 3 feet, that's I think an important minimum dimension. The height can vary by manufacturer, but like there's an A.O. Smith website that says you should have 10 feet in height because a lot of the piping comes out the top. But then their requirements change and get to be, oh, you can put it whatever you want if you're ducting in, you know, the air and you have inlet and outlet ducting. But, you know, here we are, we're just trying to plan out the physical space for a future water heater. So we don't have manufacturers' data that can be relied upon. We're just trying to set up our future building owners and homeowners for success when they want to install a water heater. So I think I'd like to keep it, at least some flexibility in here as far as the sizes. I know the 3 feet by 3 feet by 7 feet is pretty common. I don't know about the 6'8", so I can't comment to that as far as the height goes. But at least the floor space is an important one.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Any other final thoughts on water heating? Otherwise, I think we've got a pretty good direction on where to take this code language. Okay, so I'm going to move us along to large commercial because I want to absolutely save time for this, and our team has graciously put together an extra slide that mirrors the discussion that we had with small commercial so we can repeat some of our requirements that we talked about for small commercial into large commercial, or at least have a discussion on how we want those to apply. So I've got a couple of intro slides to walk us through first, just to tee up this conversation. As we know, large commercial buildings are complex and very varied in their type. And large commercial and multifamily buildings, again, I'm truncating that. When I say large commercial, I mean large commercial and multifamily buildings, 10,000 square feet or greater. So electric readiness for these spaces, same as the rest, means adequate panel capacity, dedicated panel space, wire, receptacles, adequate physical space to accommodate high efficiency electric appliances, including heating, water heating, cooking, drying, and electric vehicle. Now, we heard in an earlier meeting that word including, it can be interpreted as included, but not limited to. So it includes absolutely, when we're talking about the large commercial multifamily buildings, electric ready for heating, water heating, cooking, drying, electric vehicles. We already have EVs covered, but that's not its limit. So if there's other things that the board thinks should be included in that electric readiness, it can. So this is just another way that we wrote this out. So we needed to determine adequacy for all of these different elements. And the requirements, and this is where the statute gets much more specific in its language, is for the large commercial and multifamily buildings, 10,000 square feet and greater, must take into account the cost effectiveness of pre-wiring for the efficient electric equipment and the ability to determine what wiring and receptacle locations would be needed. And again, I'll call us back to the word and the interpretation we heard for solar ready that Carolyn reminded us of at this meeting, that adequate could mean it's adequate to not install a receptacle and a wire, and that is what the board deems as adequate. Or it could mean that, the board deems that the only adequate way to make a building electric ready is for those receptacles and wires and things like that. So that is the key word to keep in mind. And know that within the statute language, the statute really emphasizes the board consider the cost effectiveness and where those wiring and receptacle locations should be or would be needed. So this is just a different slide saying the exact same thing for those of us who like to see things in a different format. we need to consider panel space, wire, receptacles, and panel capacity, making sure they're adequate to accommodate the future install of high efficiency electrical equipment while keeping in mind cost effectiveness and where those electrical items should be located. So similarly, we have a lot, the same sort of discussions or decisions that need to be made in the large commercial space. And to start this conversation off, to give you guys a good example of starting point example, we wanted to share the City of Denver's energy code and how they considered electric readiness. And the reason, I understand for those of us in smaller rural Colorado, Denver is not always the best example, but Denver does have the highest density of large commercial buildings. And so looking to them as sort of a guidepost, we thought would be a helpful starting point for this discussion. I also want to flag that Denver has electrification requirements. And so the electric ready requirements that they have are in addition in where there's exceptions for the all electric requirements. So in today's meeting, we are not talking about going all electric. That is not part of our discussion. We are looking only at electric ready. So just want to flag that difference between Denver's code and what we're discussing today so that there's no confusion. So this is where, this is sort of the electric ready infrastructure language that we pulled from the city of Denver. So I'll just read this, and then the next slide will have the water heating requirements. So fossil fuel appliances and equipment shall be provided with a junction box located within the same space of the fossil fuel appliance or equipment that is connected to an electrical panel by continuous raceways that meet the following requirements. The junction box, raceway, and bus bar, and the panel and conductors serving the electric panel shall be sized to accommodate the electric equipment. So very similar to what we've discussed already as far as small commercial. So sized to serve the same load as the fossil fuel appliance or equipment. Very broad language. The panel shall have reserved physical space for a 3-pole circuit breaker. That's where Denver had moved to the 3-pole circuit breaker. We discussed this in our last meeting and determined as a board we wanted to call out, at least on the small commercial side, a minimum of 2-pole with the understanding that it should be sized appropriately if that means a 3-pole circuit breaker. And then number 3 here is related to the labeling. So the junction box and the panel directory shall have labels for future electric equipment. So I appreciated Denver's language because I think it captured a lot of the feedback that we've heard from the board on how you guys want to structure the electric ready code. And the key difference that I'll call out here is that within their electric ready code, the city of Denver is not requiring an electric wire to be within the raceway, and it is not requiring a receptacle. And so it's simply requiring a junction box, that raceway that connects to the electric panel, and sufficient physical space in the panel. What we met with the city of Denver's team a couple weeks ago to ask them a little bit more detail about why they took this approach. And so just to share the rationale we heard from their team is that when it comes to large commercial buildings, there are certain, and remember again, space and water heating is already required to be all electric in Denver's case. But for all of the other equipment and appliances that would be considered for electric ready, Denver was under the impression and the mindset that requiring a wire and a receptacle would in most cases not be helpful, because for future retrofits, the sizing of the wire that needs to be run to that receptacle and the design of the outlet receptacle itself is dependent on what the equipment that gets installed. And so to pre-run wire with the assumption across the board in the building that the appliance will need a certain size wire or a certain outlet type was not an assumption Denver felt comfortable making, because they thought in most cases, if that was pre-run and pre-installed, it would just end up needing to get ripped out. So it was sort of trying to save on that upfront cost that was the determination that they came to on the most cost-effective mechanism to make things electric ready. Carolyn.
Clarifying question, did they distinguish between large commercial and large multifamily in that thinking, or were they just talking generally?
That's a great question. I might have to follow up on that. I think, again, in Elizabeth, I know you were involved in the code discussions for Denver. There are requirements already for all electric space and water heating. And I think in the application of those in a multifamily setting, that leaves just a couple of items for electric readiness in that. So my guess is this would mostly be applying to things outside of the multifamily setting. But Elizabeth, I don't know if you were involved in these parts of the discussion or can add anything there.
Yeah, there were some other, and Kevin was there too. There were some other amendments that address things outside of this scope. So you may see that this isn't complete per se, because there was other amendments that would have addressed things that I think we're discussing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and thanks, Elizabeth. I do appreciate you sharing that. The Denver code was long and big, and we wanted to make sure we were focusing language in today's discussion on relevant language that the board could use and consider.
Yeah, Kim, I'll just then weigh in and say, I think the rationale has some soundness when it comes to non-multifamily commercial.
Yeah, just quick response to that. I think in terms of the application of that, whether it was, a warehouse building or a large multifamily building, we'd still be using the same building code. So I don't know that it would have distinguished between them, but Elizabeth, yeah, it's like dusting off cobwebs in the back of my mind that there was more tied to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'll keep going and then pause for a discussion up here in a moment. And Allie and Claire, just checking, can you share what slide number your slide is? Because I'm not sure I'm seeing it in my lineup.
I think it's 2 after this one.
Okay, okay.
Second one after this one.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so moving along to the Denver water heating electric ready requirements. So Denver included those two pieces of code language that we saw in the town of Erie for the minimum dimensions and the minimum exhaust volume of exhaust air. And then I just wanted to share as sort of like a final slide, some applicability and exceptions language that we see throughout the state of Colorado. And I'll say for all of the code language that we've looked at for electric readiness in commercial and multifamily, communities in Colorado have not distinguished in their code language between buildings smaller than 10,000 square feet and 10,000 square feet and greater. And so all of the requirements that we looked at last meeting as far as adjacency and labeling and a physical space and all of those things for small commercial are the same carried through for large commercial. And we have all of that language referenced in slides, so happy to pull that up if folks want to relook at those code pieces. But what I do want to call out here is exceptions, because I think within large commercial, we have a lot more, like I said, variability in building type and use type. And so here's, I think, where exceptions can come into play. And I want to note that the board, this little asterisk here, that the board cannot include exceptions for electric readiness, adequate electric readiness, again, whatever that means, for space, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying. Outside of those elements, the board has discretion on whether or not electric readiness needs to be provided. And so we see in the exceptions here for like Fort Collins and Crested Butte, in Erie and Louisville, and in Superior, this exemption for industrial and manufacturing uses. And I bring that up because it is an option that the board could consider to exempt process loads within those industrial manufacturing buildings. I don't believe that the board has the ability to say for the space and water heating requirements for those buildings, those cannot be electric ready. We can decide what that electric readiness means again. But did want to flag that that's a question within this code discussion that we'd like to bring up is, are there exceptions that the board wants to consider for this? And so with all of that in mind, we wanted to pause here. I'll share the slide, pause here for discussion. And Tim, I guess let me answer your question or hear your thought first.
You bet. Thank you. Back to that previous slide and just those 3 communities, and there's some there, the 4 communities and the exceptions. So can you touch base again? So I know that some of the all electrification ordinances that I've seen have a specific exception for commercial cooking areas or facilities for good reason. And so is that something that we'll be talking about? Or did you just say we can't do exceptions?
I would look to Adam and David on this based on the state statute language. I don't believe for kitchen cooking applications there that the board would be allowed to create an exception for that because it's included directly as one of the electric ready pieces in the state statute. And Adam, do you want to just verify that I got that right?
That's my understanding. I'm happy to kick it over to David too, but yeah, the statute doesn't say, you know, it says electric ready, which includes covering for cooking in commercial buildings. So that seems pretty straightforward to me that includes commercial cooking.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Yeah, Tim.
Thank you. So with that being said, we're going to go back to some of the discussion we had earlier with the round and round on the shell and the language that's in the ordinance or legislation talking about the cost being a factor to discuss and when we make decisions as a board. And it's my understanding the reason for not requiring, and this is on all electrification ordinances, just for clarity, to do the commercial kitchen cooking is because the availability of commercial cooking equipment is primarily, at least available in the United States. The stuff I've read is gas. And in order to get electric cooking equipment, the pieces are more expensive and you have to get them from overseas, which putting stuff on a boat coming across the big pond kind of negates the whole carbon neutral concept. So, but that's just some of the stuff I've read. So we can certainly, I guess, go down the path to do the electric ready for all the equipment in a commercial kitchen. And then similar to the discussion on these unit heaters, will probably never get used. So just a point to throw on the table, but we might have our hands tied.
Yeah, Adam, thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. And Adam, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add the point. And Tim, I think you make a valid point that it's possible that these will never get used, but I just wanted to also verify that there's nothing in this code requirement that says they ever have to convert to all electric. It's to make it so that they are capable of converting to all electric. And it seems reasonably possible to me. I mean, if you look at how technology has improved over the last 15 years, that it certainly is possible that there will be some commercial cooking equipment in the next 15 years that will be capable of being electrified much more easily than what's available today. So I think a lot of this is intended to be future proofing, not just what's available today.
Thanks, Adam. And I'd say, Tim, again, to go back to this slide around adequacy within a commercial kitchen setting, perhaps the board wants to decide that a junction box and a raceway and panel capacity is all that's needed in that, rather than running a wire and providing an outlet. And so that within that, the board has discretion on what they deem as adequate, but we still have to provide some level of electric readiness. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on the commercial kitchens. We are starting to see commercial kitchens change to electric. We did if you drive by the McDonald's in Boulder, the brand new one, that one is almost all electric kitchen equipment. So there's still a shift happening, and I think we just have to be prepared for all kinds of things that we don't have today.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'll have to check that McDonald's out sometime. Adam, did you have another thought? Is your hand just still up?
Sorry, I just forgot to put my hand up.
No worries. Okay, so within the large commercial context, thought it would be helpful, and, just bear with us because we put this slide together as we were discussing small commercial. So this was a live generated slide. So we see some areas for potential similarities between large and small commercial buildings, and then perhaps some potential differences. And so I think this is maybe a good place to pause and hash some of this out, and just generally ask for board's feedback on large commercial requirements. So similarities would be a minimum 2-pole circuit breaker sized appropriately. So if that means a 3-pole circuit breaker, then it's upsized from that minimum standard. Identification of the location for the condensate drain, adequate capacity for future and space for future transformers, and then labeling. As far as potential differences, we could mess around with the adjacency piece, the physical space for the air handler unit. Again, those two. I think we determined that A would apply across the board, B would likely just apply in a multifamily setting. And we've got numbers and letters here to stop the confusion between the boxes this time. The physical outdoor space for the condensing unit, if we don't already have one, again, multifamily, and then dedicated outdoor circuit for that, for multifamily. So I see some hands up, so I will just pass it off to the board to take the discussion away. Elizabeth and then Carolyn.
Sorry, I just forgot to take my hand down.
Oh, no worries. We'll start with Carolyn.
Thank you. I think I was appreciative of Denver's nuance about still placing the raceway and junction box, but not necessarily going to the full build out, and just ensuring the bus bar requirements within the commercial space. So for non-multifamily, which would suggest that if we go that far, I think we would still want to require all the other things associated, like, proximity to what it's replacing would probably still be important. And some of the spacing considerations may or may not, and it may be appliance specific. So I think there's something to that, especially as we aren't talking about it yet, but the cost prohibitive component of this, I think is something to just think about, and which appliances would require that full raceway, or whether there's opportunity for something different. I think multifamily is a very different space. I think it's correct. We should consider that consistent with what we talked about in the small commercial and multifamily. But for non-residential, large commercial, I support something a little scale back in terms of full build out.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I think I missed it. So you like the idea of adding proximity requirements, so that adjacency piece to this. Did you also advocate for the physical space?
Yes, I think to the extent that we're putting in raceway and junction boxes, which would be my starting place, we should also allow for that space and adjacency to be designed in.
Okay, so not including, I'm sorry,
not excluding it. So in your other chart, the one you added.
Yep, sorry.
Says multifamily only, and I don't think I'm supporting the multifamily only, assuming we land in a place where we're requiring raceway and box, but not wiring.
Okay, so adjacency would apply not just in the multifamily setting. If we're requiring the junction box, it would still need to be in the same physical space. Okay,
got it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And then I agree with the exclusion of C and D in the case of non-residential commercial.
Okay. Thank you, Carolyn. Any other board thoughts on large commercial? all right, so maybe I'll ask a more specific question. Do folks agree with Carolyn's statement that the approach in a non-residential large commercial space that Denver took, which is should just require the junction box, the raceway, and the panel capacity and space be the starting point for this, rather than requiring wiring and outlets. And if folks agree, you can maybe just generally nod your head, throw your hand up, give me a thumbs up. For all of you off camera, maybe throw a thumbs up if you're interested, or if you have a thought, please raise your hand. I'd love to hear. Thanks for those raised hands. I'll take that as a thumbs up since you guys put your hands back down so quick. Kevin, I'll go to you for a comment.
Yeah, I'd like to, I voice support for how Denver handled this, because it allows for the functionality of this down the line without the burden of the cost, and also agree with how Carolyn characterized that about I think it was B and C, was it? Yes. So supporting
A and B.
Thank you. Yeah.
And thank you this time for lettering and numbering. So we be artistic.
Thank you, Allie and Claire, for learning as we go. Okay. Awesome. So I guess I saw some general support across the board, and Kevin, thanks for speaking up in support of Carolyn's suggestion. If that feels good for the board, I guess I'll ask the question as I usually do. Does anybody not agree with that stance in that direction? Give everyone a minute to think. Okay. Well, I'm not hearing anything. So in that case, I think that gives us, sort of the direction we need for large commercial. I'm not sure that there are other pieces to this puzzle that it would be worth discussing, unless anybody has anything else that they want to bring up aside from the corn shell issue, which we will get back to. Again, considering, that most commercial electric ready codes out there are the same for small and large commercial, I think it does make a lot of sense looking at the alignment that between, the smaller and the larger size buildings. Carolyn, I'll go to you.
And just a clarification, I think, just to make sure we're all clear. So I think what I proposed is the Denver requirements. I do think which would replace the left side of this chart, correct?
Correct. So that would, it would probably still include number 1.
I think it would be space for the circuit breaker as opposed to the actual circuit breaker. And then, assuming I'm correct, I do think we should keep the, if they do not have it, the space for future transformer and the build out of that, and the bus bar rating that they had. I know they had that. So just wanted to clarify that's where I was at in my thinking. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I think I just misspoke when I said that we were aligning between the two, because there is the difference that you just called out that would change between small and large. Okay.
I also think labeling becomes less important in that context as well, and like all of that. So.
Okay. As far as labeling, right now, there is still that Denver has the requirement around labeling for future electric equipment. I know for residential and small commercial, we said we should indicate the intended use. Perhaps in large commercial, it's just keeping it the broad open. This is meant for future electrification. Okay. Seeing a head nod from Carolyn. Any others want to share their thoughts on labeling or anything else here for large commercial?
And just as a clarification, recognizing that they are going for just the space, I agree with the 3-pole. So that's another distinction from our.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Carolyn, for clarifying that. Well, if I am not hearing any other comments, I am going to hopefully correctly assume that you guys are all sort of on the same page with this one. I know we've had a lot of discussion around commercial electric readiness, so I don't think there's a ton of new stuff to hash out here. But this just feels like we're wrapping it up so quick. So I want to make sure we're giving everyone space to share their thoughts. So give it one more minute if anyone wants to state their thoughts of support or anything else that they'd like to see or address. And then we can continue on to our variance process, which is going to be a very important piece to cover today too. Kevin, I'll go to you.
Hopefully a quick question to Elizabeth. Are you comfortable with how that is characterized in item 1 about size to serve the same load as the fossil fuel appliance? I know last time we talked about equivalency between, gas requirements versus electrical, but do you feel like that language covers that disparity well?
Yeah, I remember that. It leaves it a little bit vague. And like when we just had the same discussion for the residential stuff, we were throwing in, electric backup and stuff like this. But this does let folks just convert, whatever the gas is, if it's a 100,000 BTU rooftop unit, that they just make sure that there's, 100,000 BTU equivalent kilowatt for heating capacity. So it leaves it open-ended, but I think that's okay.
Thank you.
Enforcement might be slightly challenging though for jurisdictions. I don't know. Building department folks, if you have opinions there.
I think that might be Ron or Tim. Any thoughts on that?
Could you say that again?
From an enforcement standpoint, Kevin was pointing to the number 1. Denver left that sort of intentionally open-ended and vague for engineers to address in whatever way it made sense. It was okay with Denver from an enforcement standpoint, but it does leave things a little vague for you all from an enforcement standpoint. And I don't know if you have thoughts or opinions on that.
While Ron's reading and thinking, I'll go to Tim first.
Oops, there we go. Unmuted. I agree with their process with how they wrote that. I'm not an engineer, and I never claimed to be. So I rely on the engineering folks, and this allows enough flexibility, especially as we've been getting well put, with future items and processes and equipment that comes out that are more efficient. So I think that this is really good language the way it is.
I'd agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both. Okay. Well, I think then I'll keep us moving along because these are all just the backup slides we had. So this is sort of one of the last final big decisions that the group needs to make. And so I'm grateful that we have some time to discuss it. And this is for the variance to the electric ready requirements. So within state statute, it directs the board to create guidelines for the following provisions. A standard methodology for determining how to calculate or measure when compliance with the model electric and solar ready code reaches a substantial cost differential that would require a waiver or variance for some or all of the provisions of the code. That includes the next part of that is an evidence-based uniform waiver or variance process to allow someone to request the waiver when it can be demonstrated with reasonable evidence that compliance will create a substantial cost differential. So those are the two pieces that we need to figure out is how somebody should go about calculating if they've reached a substantial cost differential. And then if they have reached a substantial cost differential, what do they have to do? What's the waiver process? And note the very specific language in here that the variance or waiver can be for some of the provisions or it could be for all of the provisions. And so the board has the discretion to say, we still want you to do X, Y, Z if you reach the substantial cost differential. Substantial cost differential means it's defined in code, which is a helpful starting point for us, that 1% or greater of the total mechanical, electrical, and plumbing construction costs of the project. And that includes, when we say mechanical, electrical, and plumbing construction costs, that includes materials, equipment, labor. So all of those things. If the electric readiness provisions for the whole electric ready and solar ready code reach that 1% or greater of the total mechanical, electrical, plumbing construction costs, that's what triggers the substantial cost differential. Carolyn.
Clarifying question potentially for David, so saying his name out loud. So I'm clear on like the how to calculate the total cost of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, construction of the project. Is it the sum of all the provisions, or is it the individual provisions that trigger that? So for example, we have EV ready, electric ready, and solar ready, or just electric ready and solar ready if we want to treat it that way. Is it whether the electric plus solar exceeds 1%, or is it the electric exceeds 1% or the solar exceeds 1%? Are they additive, or are they treated as individual provisions in terms of the cost threshold?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about it. I don't know if now is a great time to think about it, since we're all here. Why don't I commit to getting you something by Monday? In the meantime, I'll think about it right now.
Thank you, David. I think for the purposes of where we're driving the discussion today, we were considering the whole of the model electric and solar ready code provisions. So that I think maybe we, and Adam, David, correct me if this is not the right way to think about this, maybe we move forward with that as the assumption. And if that changes, you can, sorry, my cats are knocking things over here. We can redirect. Does that sound like an okay approach, or should we just to make sure we can focus in the discussion today?
I'm fine, and however we want to start with the assumption. I think it will come into play a little bit in terms of the what's waived and what's not part of the discussion.
I was interpreting it, but I will definitely defer to David, and I will have the conversation offline. But I was reading in that last bullet there when it says means 1% or greater of the total plumbing, like of all those costs. And so I was interpreting that to mean the total cost of the project. So essentially, you have the costs of complying, and you have the cost of if you didn't comply with anything. And that's where the differential comes. But I think rather than hashing it out here, like David said, I think it's better just to take it offline. But I agree, Kim. I think it's fine to at least start with that assumption, and then we will, if we determine something different, we will switch gears.
Okay, thank you, guys. Tim.
Yeah, point of or question for clarification. So these guidelines would be set the framework for the local AHJ to deal with this request. Is that correct?
Correct. So it would be, the guidelines would say, okay, if I think I've reached a substantial cost differential, how am I going to prove that? What are the things that I need to show to prove out that I've reached that cost differential? And then if it's proven that I have reached it, what do I do in lieu of meeting the requirements? Carolyn?
Another question for David to noodle on. So this clearly gives us discretion as to preserving some of the requirements. The question is, can we preserve requirements that in and of themselves still exceed the 1% threshold? If that makes sense.
Can you say that again, Carolyn?
So let's just say a project came forward and showed us that the electric ready and solar ready requirements added 5% to the total cost of the project, and therefore would be subject to this potential waiver of requirements. The provision says some or all of the provisions can be waived or varied. And what if that waiver or variance still leads to requirements that exceed 1% incremental cost on a project?
Right.
Is it an endless provision, or is it a provision that's just applied on the first set of requirements? So can it never exceed 1%, whatever we land on? Can it never exceed 1%? Or is it sufficient to set a standardized minimum requirements that have to be met irrespective of cost?
I think the latter, Carolyn, just from a quick read here, again, let me chew on it. I think the latter. I think the 1% triggers it, and then you all are determining the methodology.
But it only triggers it one time is my question.
Right. I think that's a fair reading.
Okay. Good question, Carolyn, and thank you, David. So I think let's move. This is the other part of the statute language that says where there is allowed to be a waiver for, and that's for natural disasters, and we'll move on to talking about that after we wrap up this this variance process discussion. So let's see, and remember that this only applies to large commercial multifamily buildings greater than 10,000 square feet. Small commercial and multifamily and residential buildings cannot apply for a waiver. So again, we need a methodology for how you figure out if you've reached the waiver, and then what that waiver looks like. And so the key questions that we have here are what methodology is reasonable to require, what requirements can be waived, or under what circumstances, that some or all provision, and what's reasonable to expect from an application process. So, we put a little bit of thought to this ahead of the meeting to propose some thoughts that the board could react to as a starting point. And so for the first key question here around variance suggested approach to the variance, our idea is to request that a project would need to request two quotes. They would need to have a bid that looks at the project costs with the electric ready infrastructure and one without the electric ready infrastructure, because without that, there's really going to be no way to determine what the line item difference is between the two to figure out that substantial cost differential. And so, we expect that those bids would include labor, and we would have, they would need to be specific to the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, construction cost. So this was sort of our starting point, not being in the field every day, not being, sort of on the ground and understanding how some of these bids work and what they look like. Our questions to the board are, what's that level of detail we could expect in the bid? When we define this process, how detailed should we get with that? And is a bid the best way to sort of measure that? And so I will pass it up to the board, and Tom, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I agree that just getting multiple bids is the right way to go about it. I don't know if asking for a bunch of detail in those bids is very helpful. I feel like competitive market forces will keep those prices competitive. But I'm also curious what the board thinks about in a multiple bid situation. Does the waiver use the low bid, high bid, average of the bids? How many bids are required? But I'm not really sure if you break it into labor, equipment, materials, what does that add to the conversation, I guess?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Tom. I'll go to Tim, and then Adam, and then Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you. So quite often on these projects, new commercial especially, when we get a permit application in with the set of plans, we do not see that a contractor's been selected. We don't see the valuations. A lot of times the developer owner is actually waiting to get through probably the first round of plan review comments to be able to get a bid set out for multiple bids. So I'm not sure how that comes into play with getting two quotes, because there might not have any quotes that are going to be realistic other than guesses from the design team.
Thanks, Tim. We'll go to Adam next.
Wanted to, I think, first address Tom's comment about the question about whether or not, or what the point of having the detail is. I think, at least from my perspective, there's some value because the statute very clearly says that perhaps only some of the energy or the electric and solar ready code requirements would be waived. And so understanding perhaps which of those elements are causing the biggest driver in cost differential could be helpful in understanding whether or not all of the code elements should be waived, or whether or not some of the lower cost ones that would still keep you under that 1% could be enforced. So I'm thinking about, solar readiness. Identifying a space on the roof probably doesn't cost you much. There are certain other components within these requirements that it seems reasonable that we could still enforce or still require to be enforced and still alleviate some of that cost differential concern. So I think that that's where some of the value in, between having a bid without the code requirements and a bid with the code requirements, in seeing what is driving that cost differential.
Thanks, Adam. We'll go to Carolyn next and then Kevin.
Yeah, I agree with Adam in that summary, in the sense that I think it's important to provide enough detail to validate that we agree with the assessment. I think it's less important of whether it's the low or the high bid, and more important that it's a comp. So it's the full system with the requirements and the full system without the requirements, where everything else is kept the same except for whatever is associated with the requirements they're seeking waiver from. And then to Tim's point, I mean, the onus is on the permit requester if they're seeking a waiver. The fact that they don't have that, I mean, we can, when we're doing like tech docs or other, like it would be contingent on getting the final design, like there would be contingencies placed on it. So I think I'm not as concerned about like how we normally go through the process today, and more about what they have to provide in terms of seeking waiver. And I'm really curious to hear Kevin's perspective, because I mean, obviously we do this with energy code all the time, where you're modeling to a baseline to demonstrate that you're higher than the code requirements. So I mean, I think this isn't necessarily new to the industry to seek waivers and to provide that due diligence. So I'm not so concerned about that.
Kevin, you want to hop in there?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And I do think, to Tim's question about, like, when it comes to it, by the time it gets to a building permit, these analyses have already been done. So a long time before we get to a permit ready set of drawings, we've probably, on most projects, whether it's design build or a design assist or a CMGC, we've been evaluating systems to choose that most cost effective system or choose the code compliance pathway. So I don't think it's a burden for them to provide something that illustrates that. It's not like you have to have the contractor or that subcontractor selected necessarily. So that the chances are that the information has been analyzed as any part of a responsible design team trying to design a good building that meets their client's objectives. So I think that information is there. I don't think it's onerous to ask this. And I would default to more detail than less, because it becomes pretty easy for somebody to say, well, this system's got all this stuff, and this, it needs to be apples to apples, so that there's a lot of transparency. Because I could see an unscrupulous developer saying, well, just make it so that this one is more, and make it 1% more, by the way. And you need to be able to see that backup between the two of them. And I'm not suggesting that is something that would happen with our clients or anything like that. But I think you need to have the data very clearly behind it with a fair deal of detail to understand that it really is apples to apples, and you really are showing this cost increase.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll go to Andrew next.
I'm here. No, thank you. With all the discussion on the substantial cost differential, and I do very much appreciate this discussion as a more of a residential focus. How does the board view this commercial language with respect to taking into account home affordability and David, you put such an effort into trying to summarize the commercial, 1% or greater. Is there any analogy with home affordability? Because if 1% is a threshold, is there an analogous threshold for housing affordability? If it appears the intent is there to weigh it in some context. But I don't think the board is really separately and sufficiently weighed home affordability. Now, I know that wasn't the intent of today's agenda, but being that the focus is on the commercial aspect, it felt like an opportune time to at least raise it.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think that's an important point to raise. I don't know that within the state statute and how they're defining substantial cost differential, that they made any direct ties to how that impacts home affordability or why they landed on the 1% of total construction costs. So if anyone on the board has a thought or response to Andrew, would love to hear it. But I guess from my perspective, Andrew, I'm not sure that there is that analogous impact between the two. I'll go to Adam, and then Carolyn, you might have looks like you might have a response to Andrew.
I will just first start by agreeing that the statute very clearly does not set a threshold, does not set any parameters around that consideration of home affordability. And Andrew, I guess I might disagree a little bit that the board hasn't been considering home affordability into this context, because I would say that there's definitely been considerations. I mean, just one point is talking about in solar ready about whether or not to require conduit or not because of the value of including it. I think we've had some of these conversations throughout this, talking about residential and commercial and multifamily about, the value of things that are necessary and that we know will be used in the future, as opposed to things that potentially will be used or have a high likelihood of not being used. So I would push back a little bit that we haven't considered that at all, even though perhaps that hasn't, even though there maybe has been no metric put to it like there is with this large commercial threshold, that we have considered it. And then my original comment was going to be kind of echoing what Carolyn was saying about, the impetus here really is on the project developer to put, to give the evidence to prove as to why they should be eligible for a waiver. I don't think the intent of this statute was to make it so that all large commercial buildings are being exempted from electric readiness concerns. I think that the intent here was really to emphasize the nature that, we recognize that there are some cost burdens that can be associated with some of these things, and we don't want to necessarily be extremely cost burdening projects, but at the same time, we also want them, we want to make sure as many projects can comply as possible. And I think that is evident, there's evidence of that elsewhere in the statute where it says, minimizing upfront cost while also minimizing future retrofit costs. So this is trying to strike that balance between those two things. But, that it's not, the process for this waiver is not intended to just be, that we're handing out waivers left and right to large commercial buildings, that there really needs to be demonstrated to be a burden on a large building owner that is unreasonable.
Thanks, Adam. Carolyn, I'll go to you and then we'll go to Tim.
Yeah, everything Adam said, but then some additional color from the conversations that led to this provision. And it really was a recognition of the diversity and complexity of the types of HVAC systems that go into larger projects as compared to what you see in smaller projects and residential construction, right? And so there's sufficient studies that have been conducted, independent studies, experience building that show the incremental cost of the electric ready and solar ready requirements are already mitigated compared to the total cost of HVAC. But when you start to talk about large commercial projects where you will have, anything from central to distributed systems in the same building, that level of complexity made the electric ready requirements much more challenging in some cases, and therefore there was a recognition that they wanted to constrain how much cost was placed in that case. And I would very much argue the condition does not exist in some of the smaller buildings or can easily be managed if designers know what the requirements are to begin with. So that's really where that why it only shows up here.
Carolyn, in that context, and I know this has been discussed in the pieces as we've gone along, but I mean, what's a reasonable amount? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000 to burden home affordability?
I don't think that this is an appropriate conversation or pertinent to our mission, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I'm just saying it was, I think it was addressed and I don't think we put a name on it. But, you know, I think certainly when you consider cost of finishes within a home versus an incremental cost of adding circuitry, I think that was the consideration that went into it. Again, it was addressed through the stakeholder process leading to the legislation. I'm just explaining for everybody why there was consideration of it for the large construction projects as opposed to not the others, and that we were tasked with implementing the provisions with a mindset towards mitigating the costs of those provisions we're requiring. So I think we've been staying true to our charge, and this is the final charge is acknowledging that there is this provision specific to large.
No, I thank you very much for the context and the differentiation between the two. I'm not trying to do anything than acknowledge that there's this difference, and I was more curious as to why the focus on one, and is there any analogy as to the other, and if the additional history indicates that it was the intent to permit a path for a waiver in one and the mechanism, and the other, the intent was to have it as a consideration. I think that's what you're trying to say.
That's correct. And I think it goes to this thing, and I didn't say this out loud, so I'm going to say it, is we're comparing the first cost of construction to the future cost of retrofit and choice, and trying to mitigate both in all other cases, right? So we are taking in mind what's the most expensive things that would have to be retrofitted, and that's where we're focusing our requirements in the other areas. So not driving stranded cost up front. That doesn't save us cost of retrofit later, and those were the considerations. Here, it's difficult to fully understand what the cost of retrofit might be when you're talking about this complexity of systems, and that's why it has that provision of incremental cost on the front end.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Carolyn, for addressing those thoughts. Tim, I'll go to you next.
Thank you. If I could make a suggestion, I like the approach on the slide that's up there, but I would suggest that potentially adding some language to say something like, or other engineering analysis as approved by the AHJ, which, you know, Kevin pointed out, I think well put, that, you know, which I didn't really think about, you know, in the beginning, you know, the charge for the design team is to figure out how to do it most economically and the right way for the owners, and especially for future uses. So that could be done with some sort of an analysis from the engineering team, design team, as compared to getting 2 quotes. So I think to have some kind of language in there would, I mean, even if that language wasn't in there as a building official, I would be using that with a concept no different than alternate method of design that we use occasionally out of the IBC.
Thanks, Tim. I'm curious, Kevin or others who are on that design side of the equation, do you think that like, is that type of analysis something you guys would put together out before the bids? Would that flexibility be helpful within this waiver process?
Thinking on that one a bit,
Yeah,
but because we definitely do the analysis well in advance of it coming in. Sorry, Tim, could you restate like what you're trying to add to that?
You bet. So instead of a different alternative instead of getting the two quotes for with and without, but to allow the design team to provide a different type of analysis to show those differences in costs. I mean, there's got to be other ways of doing that. I think you pointed out that you're typically looking at alternate designs that will meet the code. There's always more than one way to get from A to B, usually multiple ways to meet the codes, and it's going to be based on costs, et cetera. So I just think that a design team could provide something, and I don't know because I'm not a designer, but I'm just looking for maximum flexibility in this language here if we have to actually add this into the energy code.
Thanks, Tim. And Kevin, if that's okay, Carolyn, I'll let Kevin respond and then I'll go to you.
Sure. So I get where you're coming from, Tim, and I do think it could be, it could be developing a pricing scenario or a narrative and system criteria, because the electric ready might require. This goes back a little bit to Elizabeth and my discussion previously about equivalency between different systems and sources. But I think an analysis, either an analysis and a pricing exercise, you call that the same thing as a quote, I guess. But giving the AHJ the permission to, or the ability to define what are the criteria of those pricing studies would be helpful, because the reality is with getting the quotes at the time you evaluate these systems, you may not really have everything designed. You're getting preliminary pricing on these to say which way are we going to go, which system are we going to pursue. And one of the concerns I have with this, and I don't think we can fix anything about it, is there's always a lot more associated costs with any decision in a system than just the system itself. So maybe it affects, if you don't have one type of system, now you have to add a bunch of other components that the other system might not require. So I think having pricing that comprehensively addresses all the implications of that choice is what's really key. And that's probably where the AHJ can craft that a little bit, because somebody may say, I want to know exactly X, Y, and Z. And somebody says, show me the bottom line. And I think it's a really hard thing to put into the code to say which, but if we give the AHJ the opportunity to do that, then that could be crafted to suit different needs.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Carolyn?
Yeah, I was going to propose, rather than creating it as an alternate pathway, just clarifying that we're looking at a baseline cost versus the cost implications of it built to the code requirements, and not defining that as a quote explicitly, because they could use, like, for example, comps on recent projects, and I think that would be acceptable. Like if they just built the same building and it ran, X, and now we're saying they have to do this. I mean, I think that's the spirit of what we're getting at. So just don't use the word quotes, but really refer to the baseline cost model and then we could offer as supported by documentation such as quotes. Then I think we can accomplish that.
Okay. And I think I heard from the board that within the baseline cost model versus the compliance cost or estimate versus the compliance cost estimate, the idea would be that every variable within that is consistent aside from the electric ready considerations or the solar ready or the EV ready considerations, so that we can see line item specific detail on where the added cost is coming in.
Correct.
Okay. Am I seeing some general for those with your camera on? Is that sound right? Okay.
Yeah, and I like Carolyn's suggestion of characterizing that not just as quotes, because there's a lot of different ways to get to the decision or the data, the criteria that you need to make that choice between systems.
Okay. But within each one of these reports or whatever is produced, do they all have that cost piece in it? So like each one of these, whether it's a quote or not, would still have a number that says, here's the cost with, here's the cost without, here's the 1% difference.
I believe so, because I think it has to do that to meet the intent of the legislation.
Right. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Awesome. Any other thoughts on how someone would approach requesting a variance? I think the approach we've sort of mapped out seems pretty flexible and like it will accommodate and lend itself to more of that local control aspect. So I think maybe I think maybe what might make sense. Oh yeah, Tim, before I move us along.
Yeah, sorry. So
No.
ask another question, technical question from an AHJ standpoint. So is there any potential for someone to appeal this? And the reason I ask is in a typical adopted building code package, there is a section that allows anyone to appeal any decision by my inspectors or my me or on a plan review. And this might be a question for David and Adam, but I would assume, since I'm going to be adopting this as this added on energy code to my IECC, that my BMC probably would come into play also part of the administration rules to allow an appeal.
I don't know if I guess I can just weigh in based on my thinking about this, Tim, is that I don't think the legislation in any way prevents this from being subject to the same appeals at the local level that any code is, because it's ultimately you're the one adopting it. We aren't. The state is not adopting it. You are. So I think that would still apply.
And I really do not want to be the guy to drop a bomb on a meeting with 5 minutes left to go again, but I just put a list in the chat to say, I'm trying to think through when you ask that question, Kim, of, are there other things that that would substantiate a variance? And some things like adaptive reuse are really unusual climatic conditions throughout our state, historical status, protected districts, design districts, things like that. I'm trying to think, that's, once you start to list one, you have to list them all. And I think the intent of the legislation isn't to give a wide bunch of opportunities for that to happen. I don't know where that lives. Maybe it's a David, or I don't know. Adam's got his hand up. Maybe he's got an answer already. Please have a quick answer, Adam.
I don't necessarily know if I have a distinct answer, but I mean, so often in code, we see those including but not limited to lists, right? I mean, perhaps we could say like, be able to otherwise substantiate, have like the bids as one option and as a second option or something, be able to say kind of that what Carolyn was saying about like substantiate cost differential, including but not limited through, and give some examples of how they could substantiate it, but offer other ways. And then perhaps just, I don't know if you have to like kind of close that loop by saying like other ways approved by the building official or something like that. I don't know exactly how you kind of close that loop so that we don't just have an infinite list of possibilities, but.
And I think I might just add to that, and Carolyn, thanks for your thought in the chat. I think I tend to agree with Carolyn that while that those items might impact the system design, therefore making perhaps an electric ready, EV ready, whatever, more expensive. But I don't think that would change that these elements would necessarily change the charge of the substantial cost differential and how we would calculate that based on just the electric and solar ready code. All of those other things, if you're updating a historic structure, yeah, it might add more cost to make a historic, or I guess I wouldn't, historic status, I don't even know, because that would be an existing building. So I don't know if that helps, but I think that those factors might influence design and the price point, but the same equation of 1% would exist, and it's just for our requirements.
And for the record, I agree with Carolyn's perspective. I was just trying to throw out an opportunity to figure out how we could address Kevin's issue, but I agree with that.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. We'll go to Tim, and then Tim, I'm gonna cut off comments after you because I think I want to talk about some next steps.
I like to leave it kind of as not open as possible, but I think the board and the CEO Colorado Energy Office need to trust the local jurisdictions that we will enforce this as we need to and require documentation that we need to make valid decisions, in particular, whether a variance is allowed or not, just like we do day in and day out for different variances throughout the building code. So rather than get in the weeds and give a whole laundry list of this or that, we need to keep it general enough to allow all the different, I mean, what do we got? 64 counties in the state, and many, many cities. Trust the building officials. We're hired to do this.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, so with that, I think we have just a few moments or minutes left. So I think we will try, we're gonna have to see what code proposals come back from you guys to see if we'll have time for discussion at our next meeting. If not, our team will get together to figure out how we allow the board to deliberate on what that waiver process is gonna look like. The other thing that we will want to continue we will follow up with you guys on, and we didn't get a chance to discuss today, is how the board, if the board wants to define major alterations, and again, that will come back with the core and shell discussion. Carolyn, I'll go to you.
Yeah, just I was wondering if maybe you wanted to survey us for ideas on what should be waived. That might help the discussion along.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's exactly what our intent was. It would be to send out a survey. You guys have a lot of responsibilities, and that's what I'm going to get to next between now and Monday. So we'll take a look at our calendar view. So we have, today is Wednesday. Tomorrow, all of your responses and proposed feedback on the EV code and the Solar Ready code are due. So please do not forget. I will say, because we got an email from a board member about this, that if you guys look through a code and you don't have any suggested changes or proposed changes, it is okay from our perspective if you don't complete the survey because you have no suggested changes. We don't need you to go through and mark, no, I have no changes for every single one. So just know that to save you guys time, if you don't have any suggested changes, you can take that approach. But by 5 p.m. tomorrow, we need all of your submissions. So please, 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 please make sure to save the time to get that in. Friday, we're going to compile all of those. We'll send them back out to you guys so you can see everybody's suggested changes. We're going to ask that you guys, we're going to aim to get that out before noon. That will be dependent on how many proposals we get. So look for it early afternoon. Then you guys will have Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday morning to review those before we vote on Monday. So following up on Carolyn's point, any items that we need to follow up with, because you guys have so much to do between now and Monday, we will assign anything like that following Monday's meeting so that you guys have a bit of a break from and can focus in on what's most important in the next couple of days. Adam.
Just wanted to note too on the feedback perspective. I think it's helpful to note too that, you know, just in reading through the code, there were several like technical things that I just flagged that I think we can. So I guess my point is saying that, you know, if there's like a typo or something in the code, that's the kind of thing we could still change day of. So it's not like if the change wasn't suggested, we won't consider it. It's just if it's a substantive change that's actually going to change the nature of the code or what it's requiring. That's what has to be submitted by the end of the day tomorrow. If you have technical changes that you don't feel like you want to submit as an amendment, you just want to bring up is like this word's spelled wrong, or this is the wrong word to use there for what we're meaning. That's the kind of thing you could still bring up during the meeting too, just to make clear.
Thanks, Adam. And I will agree and emphasize that even if it's those small word changes, submitting them ahead of time when you submit the rest of your surveys will be helpful. So please try to combine it all in one.
Totally agree. I just wanted to make the point is if people catch things in the meeting, it's not like, well, too bad.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed. Okay. Well, with that, you guys have your charge. You know what's coming. We will work to clean up the meeting notes from today's meeting and get those to you guys ASAP so that we can approve those at the start of Monday's meeting. And then yeah, just look out for emails from us with all of the code proposals. And as always, thank you guys for your time, your energy, your brain power today. Appreciate you all, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays.